The proceeding will start shortly.
Order, order. Welcome to this morning's meeting of the Culture, Media and Sport Select Committee for our final evidence session on our inquiry into gambling regulation. We're joined again by Paul Blomfield, who is our celebrity guest star from the Health Select Committee, and he's taking part in these sessions by our invitation to look at the public health implications that have been raised by quite a lot of the evidence that we've taken along the lines of this inquiry. So our first panel today is with the Gambling Commission. We're joined by Andrew Rhodes, the Chief Executive, Sarah Gardner, the Deputy Chief Executive, and Tim Miller, the Executive Director for Research and Policy. Thank you all for joining us this morning. As ever, the committee will declare any interests as we go along. I will start because I have accepted hospitality from the Betting and Gaming Council over the years. To start with, can you update our committee on the progress of the white paper consultations that the Commission has been leading on?
Yes, certainly. So I probably should just explain what the Gambling Commission's role is. So we're the statutory advisors to government on gambling. We're a licensing authority, and we license the gambling industry in Great Britain, but not Northern Ireland, aside from the National Lottery. We are implementing the government's white paper, so it's government policy, and I'm sure we'll touch on that later on. There are broadly three things that are happening as a result of the white paper. The first will be legislative change made by the department itself. The Gambling Commission is not a legislative authority, so they are making changes to primary and secondary legislation, so things like the statutory levy, credit and casinos, etc. The second group are voluntary arrangements, so for example the industry being charged with designing an ombudsman on a voluntary basis, or the Premier League around sponsorship on front of shirt. And the third group, which is where the Commission's main focus will be changes to our licensing requirements, which is the LCCP, which is enforced by us. So any changes that we make to that document, we need to make sure that we consult on. We've got around 68 work streams or thereabouts. I'm sure Tim will correct me if I'm a little out there, and we're involved in about 80 plus streams overall. So our current consultations are live. They've been out for several weeks. I think there are 4 of them live at the moment, which I'm sure Tim will go into. We've had around 1,500 responses to the consultations thus far. Most of those, if not nearly all of them, are in the area of financial risk check, which is the most challenging, I would say, part of what we're doing at the moment. It's the most debated and has got some very, very strong views being expressed about it. And we still have, I think, about 6 or 7 weeks remaining in the consultation. So I think perhaps, Tim, if you just explain which consultations are out and where we are with them.
Yeah, so the first tranche of consultations covered 4 topics. So financial risk and vulnerability, which I believe the committee will want to go into in a bit more detail later on. But there's some other really important topics in there as well. So remote game design features in there. So building in greater protections for consumers in the way that games are actually designed. Improving consumer choice on direct marketing as well, really important. So actually giving consumers much greater say over the type of marketing they get, particularly in the space of cross-selling. So that would mean if you sign up, for example, to place £10 on the Grand National, you won't automatically receive marketing for that same company's online slots offer without directly opting into it. And then the final area is strengthening age verification in premises as well. So they all close on the 18th of October. We will then be fairly quickly moving to the next tranche of consultations that will be published in the winter. But I think the Secretary of State gave a very clear steer that she wanted to see the white paper implemented at speed. And I think it's fair to say that we were quick out of the blocks in getting that first set of consultations out there.
Just one thing, if I could add to that, is in order for us to do our jobs correctly, the consultation's got to be a meaningful one. We can't simply have the illusion of a consultation. If we did, we would leave ourselves open, quite rightly, to legal challenge and further delay to the implementation. So the consultation will be what it will be. We expect, well, we already know from some of the lobbying, from some of the letters we've received most recently, that there will be some very precise issues that people will object to, and we will need to work through those. and make sure we cover those things off properly. So it's difficult for us to say exactly when everything will be implemented because we need to go through the consultation properly. But I'm pleased that we got those out exactly when we said we would, and we're progressing through them, and now we'll see what we receive. I think the really detailed responses will come normally at the end when all the different parties have had more time to consider. They'll want to submit evidence, they'll have done research, and we'll need to see what that says.
So, Mr. Rhodes, it's a significant amount of consultation that you're conducting at the moment, and given that the Commission's fees aren't expected to be reviewed until next year, are you satisfied that you're adequately resourced in the interim for the amount of work that you're being encouraged to do?
Yes, I am in terms of all the consultation work. So you're quite right, our fees aren't set to rise yet, so I'll touch on fees in just a moment. So we've built a programme within Tim's area. Tim's the SRO for the White Paper programme. We've got a programme manager, and we've seconded a large number of people into that team. That's why we were able to get all of our planned consultations out, and we've done the work not just on the next round, but a number of areas which are not consultation matters as well. So I'm very confident that we're in a strong place there. Where resources will become more important will be later on when we get results out of further consultation. So, for example, the data pilot work that we're doing at the moment, with some of those results will come this month and next month. That will lead us into some investment decisions around what we do around data, and that will come at a cost. I'm really pleased that the government committed in the white paper to a fees review for the Commission early on in the implementation. Fees for the Commission did rise recently, but they had actually been deflationary for a long period of time. So our fees now, excluding the recent increases in inflation, remain well below where they would have been on a comparative basis. So I'm pleased that we had a recent fees uplift. That's allowed us to make a number of investments in areas which I'm sure we'll touch on later, such as illegal gambling and data. But I'm quite comfortable with the resources we have now, but that means that we do need to go through the consultations in a sensible order. But I don't also think that the industry or any other group of stakeholders could absorb all of the change at once. A lot of them have got very complicated tech stacks, and a lot of them have, are made up of a series of mergers and acquisitions. So the industry will also need time to ready itself for the changes, to make sure that they implement them in the right way. So I think we're going about it in the right order, and I think we've got the right resources at the moment to do that.
And so you've got enough resources at the moment, but looking forward, are you satisfied that the proposed funding regime will sufficiently cover you to implement the changes that are going to be brought forward?
Well, the commitment is a fees consultation. It's not a commitment to a fees uplift, and I think that is the right way of describing it. I think that is how government should go about it. Our fees don't increase with inflation or anything else, or with demand. So if we are dealing with more and more complicated issues, then our funding doesn't rise with that. So what I am pleased by in the white paper is the commitment to that future funding. That allows the Commission to make longer term investment decisions. We are not taxpayer funded, so we are funded entirely through fees set by ministers. Or for the National Lottery, we recover some money from the National Lottery for the cost of regulating that. So long term, yes, we will need to make sure that the funding is appropriate. We're an organisation of 351 people. We're not a large regulator, and we regulate the largest online gambling industry in the world. So if we are going to do more complicated things around regulation, that will require resources to do it. But I am very comfortable with our current position. But longer term, we will need to invest more money and have more people and different skills.
Thank you. Paul Blomfield.
Thanks very much indeed. And I wanted to ask a question about powers that you need to ensure regulatory compliance. But first, I ought to acknowledge the fact that you picked up on a point I made at a previous session in a letter to the chair. I think you're probably right that I should have clarified that I was talking about addiction and at-risk rates in relation to Luke Ashton's inquest. But I think it does raise a general question about data. Currently I understand that the figures we depend on from the Gambling Commission are based on a quarterly telephone poll of 1,000 people. I just wonder whether you think that's enough, or what you're thinking about doing to improve data collection so that we've got a firm evidence base on which to make decisions.
I think I'd probably have to hold Tim back in a second if I don't let him talk about what we're doing in this area. So, I mean, what you said there is partially true. Yes, we have the quarterly telephone survey, but we have access to a great deal amount of research elsewhere. So things like the patterns of play research, which covered, I think, a huge number of gambling accounts, is very, very informative to us in terms of how people behave and why they gamble, how they gamble, and the impacts on them. There's a lot of other research that we have access to, but I think it's probably best if Tim describes the upcoming gambling survey of Great Britain and some of our other research. I think last year was we produced more research than at any time in the Commission's history. So I think if Tim talks about the research area.
Yeah, so the quarterly survey you talk about, relatively small sample size, but we use that primarily to track what's going on sort of in slightly more real time. The really authoritative source of data historically has been the health survey carried out in each of the three nations. That for a long time was seen as the gold standard, but I think over recent years we've increasingly seen challenges with that giving us the information we need. One, because health is a devolved issue, obviously it's carried out in slightly different ways in each of the three nations and has been sometimes in a fairly inconsistent way. The second challenge around it is because it's run by the NHS, has to go through NHS Digital. We often don't get the data until perhaps a couple of years after the field work has been done. And in such a fast-moving industry such as this, we can't any longer be relying upon data from a couple of years ago. So we've been doing a really significant piece of work over the last year or so to actually take ownership of that data and research ourselves. And we will, over the coming months, be launching what will actually be the largest survey of its type into prevalence and participation of gambling anywhere in the world. We think that will give us much more accurate information, importantly much more timely information, and information that for us, the gambling regulator, we will have much greater control over how that's run. So certainly I recognise some of the kind of the challenges with the data that we have, and we've invested a lot of time and energy in ensuring that we're going to have a much more effective way over the coming months.
Thanks very much. I mean, you would... one piece of data that we have got, which I assume you'd accept, is the Office of Health Inequalities and Disparities assessment of gambling suicides, which they did obviously extensive work, which you'll recognise, and concluded between 117 and 496 additional suicides took place primarily where gambling was the primary factor, or gambling addiction was the primary factor. I just wondered, how does the Commission learn from gambling deaths?
If I say something about that first. I mean, this is a very sensitive and difficult area. There is nothing that I or anyone else can say to someone who's lost a loved one, who's taken their own life. It is an exceptionally difficult topic and understandably emotive. What we do, where we're informed that someone has taken their life and gambling may have been a factor in their life, we will look at the gambling behaviour that they undertook. We will contact all operators to determine if that person has gambled with any other operators. Quite often we find that they have. And we will try to assemble a pattern to see whether there are any potential breaches of our licence conditions and try to understand what may have happened in this case. It's a very difficult one because it's for coroners to determine why if someone took their life and what the circumstances of that was. Wherever that happens, if we're asked to participate, then clearly we will. This is an area that will be a feature of the Gambling Survey of Great Britain as well, in terms of ideation and whether people have had suicidal thoughts. It's an area that is underexplored, and it is difficult to have reliable figures on exactly what this looks like, partly because the circumstances are so unique to individuals, and it is a very, very difficult topic to explore. So in the event that we're aware of someone who has taken their life where gambling has been a factor and we're informed of it, then we will always have a look into those cases and try and determine what we think can be learned from it. And if there are things that we think can be learned from it, then that is built in to what we do. Having looked at a number of cases where people have taken their own lives, very tragically, it's clear that some of the gambling behaviours that were seen for those individuals, regardless actually of causality, some of the things that you would hope to do in those cases are features of the government's white paper in terms of some of the early interventions that we think would be sensible. They are not necessarily designed around the risk of someone taking their own life, but they are things that would, we think, help. But certainly the Gambling Survey of Great Britain, this will be a feature of, because it is an area that it is very difficult to say definitively what the position is, partly because we also rely on coroners who will make a determination which may be some years after the passing of someone.
Thanks very much. I mean, it's helpful to know that you'll explore all deaths that you're alerted to you, because obviously a very small number actually go to coroners' inquests. I wonder if I could move then to the issue of the powers that you need to ensure regulatory compliance. And whether you think, I mean, obviously the size of fines and regulatory settlements has increased in recent years. Do you think that has strengthened deterrence for preventing bad behaviour from operators? Or do you think that they just kind of factor it into the business planning as a necessary cost in what's a very profitable business?
I think you've just outlined the two greatest accusations that the Commission gets in this area. The first is that the industry is terrified of us and it constantly lives in a state of perpetual fear that the Commission will turn up at any moment and hit them incredibly hard for no obvious reason. The second is that gambling operators simply shrug these things off. Neither of those things are accurate, and I don't mind the question in the slightest. I set out in November 2021 it happened to be at the Gambler conference that the Commission would focus on what I described as recidivist behaviour. So these are operators that we are seeing for a second or, God forbid, a third time, and that we would escalate penalties, and that's exactly what we've done. So during the last year, we've seen the two largest penalties levied anywhere. I was told last week by someone in the industry who's been looking at patterns across the world in terms of gambling regulation, and they told me, and this does tally with what I've seen, that 9 out of 10 of the largest penalties and 85% of all the activity in the world in gambling regulation comes from us. So I would say that we're being very active. Your question is, are we seeing improvements? Well, we are definitely seeing less egregious cases, and I'm sure we'll touch on those, but we're not seeing none. That's an odd thing to say. We're not seeing their absence altogether, sorry. In terms of our compliance activity, so in Q1 22-23, we conducted 5 cycles of compliance and we only saw a 20% compliance level. In 2023-24, we executed 21 cycles and saw 95% compliance. So we are seeing an improving picture. But the other thing I would say is our overriding strategy has been compliance at the earliest opportunity. Penalties are something that happens at the end when the operator is either so egregious that a penalty is the right thing to do, or we've not been able to secure compliance straight away. They've decided to object to it, whatever their reasons will be. What I would say is our engagement with operators to secure compliance at the earliest opportunity is working very well. We are seeing a much more rapid response. And that, I think, is getting us into the right place. But I can tell you now that the penalties that we have put in place have caused the industry some real distress. They are very profitable companies, but it does cause undoubted distress. And we have seen a difference. The other thing that the industry says itself, and this is many of the people I talk to, as well as I think the trade body as well, the industry has not done itself any favours in recent years with some of the cases that we've seen. And in all of the examples I'm talking about, the penalties, the operators have accepted that those were breaches and those were failings and have agreed that it needs to be put right. People will argue about why wasn't it right in the first place, and I think that's a very justifiable question. But I think we are seeing success in this area, undoubtedly. And, I think that's what we need to continue to press on.
Thank you. Just one final question for me about regulatory settlements. You've recently taken the decision to transfer, I think, about 32 million of regulatory settlement money to Gamble Aware to distribute. Now, I think that's a sort of transitional step as we move from kind of the current settlement to the sort of post-white paper architecture. Obviously, that's money which previously is used by, or has been made available to, third sector organisations who won't accept industry money. I just wondered what you thought was the kind of future position for those organisations to receive funding during this transitional period. I mean, we're talking about organisations which the government leaned on or drew on very heavily in the work that they did on the white paper.
Yeah, so I'll say a few things on that, and I think Tim might want to go into a bit more detail around regulatory settlements. So regulatory settlement funds have grown quite considerably as we've taken more and more action. A commission cannot use any of those funds to pay for the administration of the distribution of those funds. We can't take money for assessing the efficacy of any of that work. And the funds are at such a size that we think that it ought to be with a body that does have that capability, and that's consistent with our statement of principles. The funds are not industry money, so I appreciate there are bodies who do not want to take funds from the industry, and that is partly where the statutory levy decision making, I think, comes from. So these are ring-fenced funds. They're ring-fenced by Gamble Aware. They have come from regulatory settlements. They are predominantly to ensure system stabilisation as we move towards a statutory levy. We don't know exactly when a levy will take place or at what level, and what we would not want to see are bodies who are currently funded and have good, solid programmes that will stand up to scrutiny being unable to get funds when those funds are actually available. But it's not the Gambling Commission's job to ensure that particular parties are funded. The regulatory settlement funds are meant for things like innovation and for one-off funding. They're not meant to support particular charities or anything like that. And this is why we think the System Stabilisation Fund is the right way to go until the statutory levy is introduced, which is obviously the government's stated intention. And then I would anticipate the regulatory settlement funds would then join with the levy funds. This committee also was critical of the Gambling Commission in terms of how we handled regulatory settlements, which we took on board. And we think actually there is a better way of doing it. And Tim, if you wanted to add to that.
Yes, I mean, as Andrew says, since regulatory settlements first became available, we've seen the volume of them increase quite considerably, to the point where, as Andrew said, this committee and others rightly raised some questions as to the rigour that was in that process. And I think where we found ourselves with the sort of volume of settlements we were talking about was that, frankly, we would have needed to put in place a proper commissioning framework in order to administer those properly. Now, as a gambling regulator, that's not our role. But secondly, because we can't take any of those regulated settlement monies to fund that, we would have been subsidising that from our core regulatory funding, which would mean taking money away from regulating the industry, addressing any regulatory breaches that we've seen in order to do that. Gamble Aware, range of different people have a range of different views on them, but they do have an established operating commissioning system in place. And we felt in the short period of time between now and when a statutory levy comes into place, that was the most kind of efficient and effective way of ensuring appropriate rigour around how the money is used, and ensuring that actually there isn't a sort of a cliff edge that happens between now and when regulatory settlements come in. And that was the reason for taking that decision.
I mean, you're right. I mean, we shouldn't get into the argument about Gamble Aware, but you'll recognise that NHS England withdrew funding from them on the basis of concerns over the industry funding. So I guess that it would be helpful to at least have an assurance that you don't think that the decision that you've made for the interim should in any way influence the post-white paper architecture for the sector?
Yeah, certainly that's not the case at all. I mean the government will decide and set out what that architecture will be. We're very clear that we don't see ourselves having a key role in that other than collecting the money in from operators. And certainly the intention of the decision we made around regulated settlements is in no way to influence what that future system will look like. It was simply to recognise the quite legitimate kind of questions that this committee raised about how we were running that system, and also to recognise that actually there is a risk of a fairly bumpy transition, and we wanted to make use of that substantial pot of money to try and aid that transition.
Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Damien.
Thank you, Chair. One of the threats that the industry holds over you and the government is that if you over-regulate, people will be driven to unlicensed sites, which will do even more harm. Do you give any credibility to that threat?
So we hear this a lot, and I've said in public a number of times, I think the risk is overstated, but I don't think there is no risk. So talking to a lot of people around the industry, they will tell you that actually within the GB market, to be technically correct about it, actually the size of the black market is very small in terms of what they estimate the position to be. But estimates do vary. So what I would say about this is we've been very active in the space of tackling illegal gambling. So we've taken 500% more action between 2021-2 and 2-3. Most recently, 4 of the top 10 illegal domains for it will be online casino targeting the self-excluded. 4 of the top 10 are now geo-blocked. We've seen a 46% reduction in traffic to the largest illegal sites coming into our market. We've also, with Google, I think it's 17 sites have now blocked from Google search results. We've worked with MasterCard, also removing payment facilities from illegal sites, plus we've served cease and desist notices against a number of media outlets for advertising illegal gambling. So we're having a lot of success in this area. However, every time I've heard someone say to me, well, based on what's happening here, people are going to the black market, I've asked them the same question. Tell me where. And I have not once had an answer. I have not once been given the name of an operator or a person or a location or anything I can act upon. And I have consistently asked that question every time. There is undoubtedly a risk that if people cannot gamble in the legitimate industry, for a number of reasons, they may go somewhere else. So we have to get the balance right, which I think is what the white paper is trying to do. But also the Commission needs to be very proactive, as we are, in tackling illegal gambling.
You say that the illegal market is very small. You'll have seen the PwC report commissioned by the Betting and Gaming Council that said it had roughly doubled in size recently. Do you just reject that?
Well, it depends what you're talking about in terms of what's doubled in size. So the conversations so first of all, the PwC report relies on the same data that we do in terms of channelization. So channelization is, I think it's either 96 or 97%. And what that means is how many things can you gamble on. So we have the most liberalised market in the world, which suppresses illegal gambling. In markets where they don't have high channelization, they have a lot more illegal gambling because people want to gamble on certain things, so they will. If you look at, based on the discussions we've had with research bodies, including YieldSec, who the BGC have quoted in public, what we see happening is the growth is largely in targeting self-excluded people through online casinos, specifically looking at not on GamStop, which is the tool that allows people to fully self-exclude from online gambling. And that is where we have seen the growth. It's actually very difficult for illegal operators to get access to the UK market because it is so competitive and the channelization is so high. Other countries around Europe, and my 2 colleagues, and Sarah, in fact, was in, I think, Denmark recently, they are looking to our model in terms of channelization and our approach as the way to combat illegal gambling.
Do you feel that you know enough about the illegal market? Is your research in that area satisfactory?
I don't think we do know enough. It's in our evidence gaps and priorities plan for the next 3 years. I think there are too many people claiming they know more than they do. Talking to operators based on what they see around Europe in particular, I don't think we have a large black market, but research isn't as good as it needs to be. But it's also very difficult to estimate the size of something that is illegal. There are plenty of surveys which don't really hold a lot of water in terms of methodology, which will tell you certain things. But the evidence base isn't as strong as it needs to be. And that's why it's in Tim's team's research programme over the next 3 years.
One of the new powers proposed for you is to act against third-party providers. Do you think that's going to be effective?
Yeah, so we want the power of injunction, effectively. We want the ability to injunct anyone who is facilitating illegal gambling. We've taken an awful lot of action, particularly during the last year, which has been very successful, and a lot of that's been done in partnership. Some of it's been using our cease and desist powers, but our ability to have further powers would mean that we could do things more rapidly. It's a power that the French regulator has recently been given, and we're watching with interest how they use it.
And it will require a court order. Does that delay things?
Actually, the French one doesn't require a court order, is my understanding. So
but the proposal here is, I understand it, that you...
But from my point of view, I would like just to be able to issue the injunctions so that we can move as quickly as possible. But that's something that will be consulted on, I've no doubt.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Jane.
Thank you. Just as a follow-up, I wondered to myself, could I use a VPN and just gamble anywhere? And a quick Google brings up dozens and dozens of sites offering exactly that. So how can we combat VPNs?
So VPNs are the other issue that we face, which is why we're working with internet service providers, because there is an ultimate destination, which is the router wherever you are. So people can use VPNs, yes, and that is one of the issues. So that's why we need to do more work with the tech sector to find ways to combat that. However, one of the reasons that we've been specifically looking at payment methods, I think we've issued 3 cease and desist notices recently against FCA regulated payment providers, is to make it more and more difficult to transact anyway because of where those sites are. So it's to prevent your money being able to move. We're also talking to the FCA as well about crypto organisations who are on the sort of the list that the FCA use where they can advertise, for example. We're also looking at that area as well. So VPNs is a weakness in the system. It is there to circumvent things like geo-blocking. That doesn't mean that we haven't had success with the other interventions that we've put in place in the last year. But VPNs and how we deal with that problem is definitely one of those that we keep working on.
Do you have any idea of the scale of VPN use? I presume data gathering from VPNs is nigh on impossible.
I would think it's probably very difficult, yes. I personally don't have that information in terms of VPN usage generally. I mean, they are widespread on pretty much any app store. You can download a VPN for a variety of purposes. What I will say, though, is quite a lot of legitimate operators have blocked VPNs themselves. So if you're in Australia, for example, and you try and use a UK gambling site, even through a VPN, you'll quite often find that you can't. They do constantly update those, and that's so that they don't offer gambling illegally in another jurisdiction. So there are things that can be done with VPNs.
How do they know that you're not in Australia if you give an address random address in Melbourne?
So VPNs use rotating IP addresses which are in different countries. If you see a spike in usage, a bit like the way that we detect unusual patterns in gambling behaviour, if you see a spike in usage, then that can be alerted and then they start to block those IP addresses through VPNs. But it is a constant chase.
And are we doing enough compared to countries like Australia?
Actually, this work is being done by UK companies who have spotted those patterns. I use Australia as an example just because I conducted my own test and you can see how it works.
To follow money, that must be incredibly difficult, because how do you know where money's going if it's going via a website that's...
So it's to do with the payment providers themselves. So if MasterCard is advertised on an illegal site, we alert them and they will remove the payment facility, which makes it harder for you to make payments.
They're not illegal sites.
Sorry?
Are they illegal sites?
They're illegal sites, yeah.
VPNs are illegal.
I'll separate the two issues out. There are illegal gambling sites and there are VPNs. So what we have done with the payment providers is tell them who the illegal sites are. So even if you were using a VPN, your money cannot move from a UK financial institution into an illegal one.
But what about legal foreign operators? How would they pick up? They can't pick up money going to... If it's a legitimate online gambling set up in the US, how do they know if...
Well, if you are operating legally in another jurisdiction, in order to take custom from the UK, you have to have a licence here as a point of consumption law. So legal operators will always have to have a licence in this country.
Yes, I don't know if that, but if they're duped into money going in, I don't see how a UK customer who gives an address in America or is there not? Does that circumvent regulation?
I don't think I'm quite following your question.
If I were to give a false address in America and you do it via a VPN, which just masks where my computer was, if I transfer money, is there any trace of that going over to?
So any money you transfer from a UK institution is traceable. So what we're focused on are payment providers. So the payment provider will know where your money has come from. So you can't mask that. So if you're using MasterCard, for example, to make a payment to an illegal site, if we are aware of that illegal site and we've notified MasterCard, they will not allow a transaction to go from the UK to an illegal site. That is traceable. It doesn't matter whether you use a VPN or not, or whether you lied about your address, none of that is relevant.
And that, where do you think there's improvements to be made to cut down on VPN?
I can't say I know enough about what we need to do on VPN. VPN is one of my concerns around illegal gambling because, as I said, we have geo-blocked 4 of the top 10 illegal sites. We've seen a 46% reduction in activity. Some people will use VPNs to try and circumnavigate that. But sites who are geo-blocking know they can't access our market. They will be looking for the same rotating IP address patterns as legitimate operators will. But VPNs is a challenge, which is why we need to do more work in the data and technology space to find ways that we can make that even harder.
Thank you. Simon.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, Andrew. I want to talk about the Gambling Ombudsman, and do you have any concerns about how effective and fully independent it can be, given it isn't statutory?
Well, our advice was very clear. We said that we thought the Ombudsman should be a statutory Ombudsman set up on a statutory basis. We understand why the government hasn't gone down that route, particularly the time remaining in Parliament. So what is written in the white paper is that we have to be satisfied that the Ombudsman is sufficiently operationally independent of the industry. It will also have to meet the Ombudsman Association. Yeah, I've got that right, because Tim always has to correct me on this. I always called it something else, but the Ombudsman Association standard, otherwise it can't be called an ombudsman, and that has a series of minimum standards. Tim is ex of ombudsman, so we will need to see what is specified by the industry and whether it meets those standards and whether we think it's operationally independent. That's work that's being overseen by DCMS, which we'll become involved in, I think, as it goes further on. Add to that?
Yeah, I mean, industry themselves made the offer that they would seek to establish this ombudsman and make sure that it's properly independent. And I think it's for all of us, DCMS, probably this committee as well, to hold industry to account for that. And if they fail to make a proposal that's sufficiently independent, if what they come forward with is something that is inherently compromised, then I think the white paper was very clear that the government would then look to legislate to put it on a statutory footing. So, industry have got an opportunity here. They, stick to their commitment. They deliver something that consumers properly have trust in, or the alternative will be that statutory ombudsman. Now, as Andrew said, our advice recommended that statutory would be preferable, but we do recognise, particularly given where we are in current Parliament, that could mean that an ombudsman is some way off. I do think if the industry proposal is genuinely independent and effective, then we can get an ombudsman in place sooner, and that would be good for consumers. But really, it's for industry to demonstrate the commitment of their words.
Firstly, how soon would you like to see this set up? So full proposals and your agreement to it and everything else, how quickly would you like to see this?
I think the white paper spoke about it being established by next summer. Certainly, I think we would like to see it established as soon as possible, because we see in our own conversations with consumers, the calls into our contact centre, the real need for clear, independent redress for consumers. It's important, though, that what is established is properly independent, is effective, has consumer confidence. And if that's rushed in much more quickly...
How do you judge consumer confidence if it's not there yet? And how long would it take to judge consumer confidence?
I mean, different ombudsmen approach that in different ways. So, my background prior to the Commission's been with a number of ombudsmen, and ombudsmen themselves look to measure consumer confidence with that system. Part of that is through the use of that system. Do we see an increase in consumers feeling comfortable in bringing forward their complaints compared to the system that we've got now? How satisfied are consumers with the outcomes that they receive? They will be the sort of measures. And they're things that you can probably start to measure fairly quickly.
Timescale?
I think frankly, impossible to say, in part because, the Ombudsman will also be independent of us as a regulator. And I don't want it to seem like we ourselves, at this stage, trying to set sort of performance standards for any future ombudsman.
How much did you, as the Commission, push back on the idea of it not being statutory and the idea there isn't the parliamentary time? I know it's going over all ground, but it's important to understand, you put it in very Yes Minister style language. But did you push back? How hard did you push back? And did you feel that there was any movement at all?
So I suspect Tim will want me to answer that bit. I'll try not to be too Yes Minister then. So we raised our concerns about it not being statutory in terms of whether consumers would have sufficient confidence in it. The main point for me, which is the thing I was just jotting down now, is if you're to have an ombudsman that isn't statutory, what the industry wants is it to be a licence condition. So it's part of the LCCP, you have to do it or you can lose your licence. In order for us to do that, we'd have to consult on it. And for us to consult on it, we'd have to believe it was properly independent and consumers would believe in it. And it was something that we could put our name to and that our board would be prepared to put its name to. And, our concern if the Ombudsman didn't live up to those standards is that we couldn't do that. So it has to have that rigour. Otherwise, we simply will not be able to make it a licence condition because it doesn't meet the required standards. So how much did we push back? Well, as Tim said, we understand the constraints of parliamentary time, and it is better to have an ombudsman than not to have one. 98%, I'm told, of our correspondence we can't really deal with because we're not an ombudsman, but people would like us to be. One of the biggest criticisms of the Commission, and there are plenty of lobbies who would like to criticise us, but one of the criticisms is that we don't deal with individual cases because we were not set up as an ombudsman. So we really want to see one. But it's got to be something that can fill that role. And we were very, very clear about that. And that is why the white paper says it has to be properly independent of the industry. This is work that DCMS are leading on at the moment. Obviously, we're cited on because we will have a relationship with the Ombudsman, because I'm hoping it will be drawing out themes that we need to look at as licence issues.
And let's remember that our advice wasn't given in secret. We published it on the same day as the white paper, nor has government sought to try and kind of hide that advice. The white paper itself linked directly to our advice. So I don't think this is a case about us soft-pedalling that advice or government trying to avoid any areas where there were slight differences of views.
I want to ask about, obviously, the Ombudsman for social responsibility complaints, but alongside, of course, 8 ADR providers for other disputes. Will that be confusing for customers who gamble?
Yes, I think would be the answer if that's where we end up. And I think we were clear that what we wanted to see was a single ombudsman that could deal with the entirety of consumer complaints. Certainly, you look at the criteria that the Ombudsman Association set, they've always been very clear that having multiple ombudsman or complaint systems within one sector is not desirable. I think consumers need to very clearly understand where they can go when they've got a complaint. And certainly we were clear in our advice that a single ombudsman to deal with the entirety of those issues would be the right way to approach things.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Julie.
Thank you, and good morning. How will gambling operators have to respond if a customer does not pass a financial risk check?
So we probably need to sort of explain sort of the rationale behind this, what we're trying to guard against, because actually this happens already. There are a number of operators who already have checks in place on basic financial risk who turn away customers. because of their level of financial risk, and this already happens, and it's a commercial decision that they have made. In terms of why these things are in place, or rather why we propose it, and the white paper says that these things should be in place, is if you look at the history of cases that we've seen in the last not very many years, they are quite extreme. People losing, well, as an NHS nurse on a salary of £30,000 a year, losing £245,000 in 3 months, customer losing £70,000 over 10 hours within a day of opening their account, customer earning £1,400 a month, having a deposit limit of £1,300 a month, another customer losing £23,000 in 20 minutes. What we are trying to guard against are people with high velocity gambling, or gambling that might be reaching a level that they can't actually cope with. We're talking about 3% of accounts. Vast majority of people actually gamble an awful lot less than that. 84% of accounts in our patterns of play research spend less than £200 a year. We're talking about a narrower window of customers. In the event that I don't think actually the financial risk checks are necessarily a pass-fail, they are there to help guide the operator on the risks that individual may well be facing. So that's what it's there for. It is not there to pass-fail.
How will the new checks interact with existing requirements around customer safeguarding?
So there are a range of things that operators need to do which aren't just about financial. So they are there looking at, for example, someone's patterns of play. So somebody could be gambling for very long periods of time. They need to intervene. They should be having a break. They should be made aware of how long they've been gambling for. They should have tools available to limit things like that. So it's actually about a range of factors, not just the financial ones. We talk about the financial ones more because when you hear a really difficult story, it is normally the level of money that they lost that we tend to talk about. But actually, combined with that, it will be the length of time that they were gambling as well, and the variety of things they were gambling on. So actually, there are quite a range of risk factors. So somebody who is gambling more frequently...
How will they all interact with each other? How do you see it working?
So operators have to have policies and processes in place to take those things into account, a lot of which they already do. What is different here is the government setting minimum required standards in terms of financial vulnerability and risk. But already operators do look at how frequently someone's gambling, what they're gambling on, how they are splitting things between products. So more than 56% of people in the patterns of play work were betting across 2 to 5 subjects, and that's how they build a risk profile for that individual, and that's what they look at.
What requirements will you place on operators to protect customer data? Because there's a lot of data going on here.
There is a lot of data going on here, which is why we've worked hand in hand with the Information Commissioner's Office from day one on this. Tim, do you want to expand a bit on that?
Yeah, and it's really important because whenever you're dealing with people's data, people want to feel that they can trust the way that data is being used, that it's not going to be misused. So as Andrew said, we've worked incredibly closely with the expert data protection regulator, the ICO, to ensure that the right protections are built into it, to ensure that this is compliant with data protection legislation. And they will continue to work with us as this is developed further. Importantly, the rules will be very clear that any data that is collected through this can only be used for the purposes of helping to protect consumers, cannot be used for commercial purposes. And if operators were to do so, then not only would they find themselves on the sharp end of regulation from us, but also from the Information Commissioner as well. And I think that's really important that consumers do have that trust and confidence in terms of the effectiveness of any protections. If consumers don't feel that their data is going to be used fairly and kind of responsibly, then actually they will seek to try and kind of opt out from these systems. You know, it does increase the risk of them trying to circumvent it. So it has been kind of really hardwired into the development of this work.
And will it be for gambling operators to conduct their own checks, or will they pass it on to third parties to do it on their behalf?
There'll be a mixture. We recognise that a lot of the data that's involved is not held by gambling companies and doesn't necessarily need to be held directly by them. So we in government have been working very closely with people like the credit reference agencies, and so there will be a heavy reliance upon the sort of information that they've got to carry out checks, to provide appropriate assurance to gambling companies. But what that doesn't do then is allow gambling companies to kind of off the hook in terms of the existing kind of requirements that we have. And you asked the question about how it interacts with some of our existing protections. And certainly they are complementary. It has long been expected that gambling companies understand their customer, understand the risks that their customer faces. And so gambling companies will need to conduct their own assessments. They will need to look at the information they've been given by credit reference agencies and others and decide what does that mean in the context of the player patterns that they're seeing for individual consumers, and what do they as a company need to do to protect those consumers. And really that's no different to what we've expected them to do for a very long period of time. The difference is that actually the industry themselves were saying to us, we want to ensure that we're all acting consistency. We want you to give us kind of a clearer steer as to, at what level should some of these checks kind of kick in. And that's exactly what this work is doing. The white paper set out a very clear policy around bringing in these checks. And what we're consulting on is how you bring those into practice.
You've mentioned credit reference agencies as being one third party that will be used. What other types of organisations are going to be used? Or do you see being used?
So I think, at the moment it will primarily be credit reference agencies, but clearly there's a range of other data that can be publicly available that can be useful here. So we've referenced in the consultation, for example, postcode data can be really useful in terms of helping you understand where areas of deprivation exist. Now that won't necessarily immediately tell you that for that customer that lives in that postcode that they are at greater risk. But if they're living in an area of greater deprivation, then actually I think it's right that we say there is a greater onus on the operator to really understand whether that customer can afford the sort of gambling that they're engaged with. So that sort of publicly available data would be something that would supplement what you'd have from credit reference agencies.
But it's important to say that these things are taken in combination, because there are quite a few people who comment on this, and I can almost guarantee someone's writing a tweet right now saying the Gambling Commission says whether you can gamble or not depends on whether you live in a poor area or not. And what we're actually saying is there's a whole wealth of data that can be used that builds a risk picture, and it's not one thing on its own, where you take things in combination. So, there is no guarantee because someone lives in an area that they have a particular income, but you take it in combination with something from credit reference agency, other public information and other information you can gather, you start to build a risk picture. And we estimate that we would have extremely high coverage of anybody who would be needing to go through an enhanced check. It's only 3% of accounts that we're talking about, which actually in terms of risk overlaps with the overall profile of gambling risk. So those two things go together quite well. That is something, of course, that the industry very loudly said it wanted us to do, and wanted the government to do in the white paper is leave the majority of people who loan who don't necessarily pose a risk and focus on the higher risk area. These two things do overlap.
So you haven't commented yet on this. Is there anything you want to add to this?
Well, one of the points I was just about to come in actually and say was I think it's important to realise this is often presented as a new thing that the Commission's kind of dreamt from nowhere quite recently. But actually, we've had the outcome that we're looking for on our rule book for many years now, and in fact in its sort of most modern form since at least 2014-15, I think I'm correct in saying, when we did a big review of social responsibility measures, and that is the outcome that gambling operators must take all steps to identify customers who are at risk and intervene appropriately. Now, clearly the kinds of cases that Andrew's outlined there, that we've seen in our case workload, are inconsistent with that outcome. So actually what we're doing here, I think, to some extent, is spelling out a rule that we've had on the rule book for some time, and I think the industry, as colleagues have said, have expressed appetite for that, and I hope that's what we're doing. And we really would like people to tell us how this can work most effectively, and that's why we're consulting, and I hope people will respond as they clearly are doing. Thank you.
Yeah, Kevin.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. And can I also repeat my declaration from the previous session in relation to hospitality with the BGC. You wrote to us actually about the statistics which Paul Blomfield referred to earlier on that letter. Do you think we should ask BBC's Radio 4's more or less to adjudicate on the various, because you're critical of both sides in this in relation to statistics, to adjudicate on who's right.
We actually considered that ourselves.
Did you?
We did. The only reason we
to more or less, or
well, actually, it was some of our research and statistics teams thought that would be quite good. We thought it might be a bit niche, to be honest, but it's
a niche program. Yeah.
It is a very niche program. Gambling is even more niche, but no, we did seriously consider it. And the reason that we've taken the position we have, and why I set out to put out a public letter, is that at the moment I think the debate around gambling can be very, very poor quality. I think there are very, very strong views, and we have seen statistics used in a way which can misrepresent.
We asked the Statistics Authority, which I used to be a minister responsible for many years ago, to run the rule over our sort of report when we come up with it, to check, because you were quite critical of some of the questions as well by members of this committee. Run the rule over it and see whether or not it holds up, because they're responsible for checking official statistics.
Well, certainly we've talked to the official statistics regulator about...
Have you talked to the Statistics Authority about this?
Yeah, so we work closely with all the different statistics bodies, so the Office for Statistics Regulator, the official statistician as well, because obviously what we deal with primarily are the official statistics.
What about the Statistics Authority? Have you been in touch with them?
So through the official statistician,
right?
Yes.
Okay. Through the ONS, basically. Yeah.
Yes, that's right. And I mean, certainly, if the committee, when producing their report, wants the authoritative voice around the gambling statistics, we are very happy to kind of offer any of that.
Okay.
To you.
On the matter that Julie Elliott was asking about the affordability checks, I was in the House when the Secretary of State announced the white paper and made a statement on the 27th of April, and in her statement she said that most people, I think it was 80% of people, would have to do nothing at all in relation to that, whilst 20% would have a simple check on whether they have a county court judgment against them. Is it your intention in what you're doing at the moment to implement what she said in that statement in the House?
Our intention is to implement exactly what the white paper says. That's what we've been charged with doing.
When she introduced the white paper to the House of Commons, that's what she said to the House of Commons, and obviously that's, as we know, quite a serious matter. That when a minister makes a statement to the House of Commons, they have to be truthful, and we've actually managed to establish that with the former Prime Minister, that it's a serious matter if you're not truthful about it. But so, did you hear what she said in that statement, and is that what you're trying to implement?
Yes, absolutely. So our estimate, and indeed the white paper's estimate, is that in terms of the lower level financial vulnerability checks, around 21% of accounts will be caught by those. But again, on those checks, there isn't an expectation that the customer will need to do anything. This is checks that an operator will be able to do on county court judgments and so on. Worth saying, in the consultation, we have asked the question about whether operators should take account of the job title that consumers
that's right. Is it? So it's job titles, employment status, and their home postcode.
Yep.
Are the three things I think that are in additional to what she said in the House. And would that fulfil what she said?
So I wouldn't say that's in addition to what she said. It's worth saying that
it's not an addition.
With all of the consultations,
is it in addition to what she said, or is it not?
No, I wouldn't say it is
okay.
in addition. I think it's a part of it. But specifically around job titles, we have asked the question, should this be included? And the reason we've asked that question is that gambling operators themselves, many of whom are actually using that sort of information when accounts are being opened, have said it's been a really helpful thing to have.
If someone gave their job title in one of these sort of frictionless checks, would they have to supply documentation to prove that they were telling the truth?
No.
Right, so you could just invent the job title if you're asked. You could just say, I'm an astronaut.
So you could, but what we've said in the consultation is it's a piece of information that could helpfully go alongside.
How would it be helpful if you don't know it's accurate?
If it's not true, if you were looking at it by itself, then I think that would be problematic. But actually, what we said is it could be a useful addition to it. But importantly, this is a consultation. We've asked the question. We've invited people to provide us with evidence as to whether they think that would be a helpful addition or not. I think it's really important that we don't lose sight of the fact that this is a genuine consultation.
Okay. And so in what way would the postcode be useful? So we've established that basically you're asking the question, I accept that, as to whether somebody being asked their job title, fictitious or not, would be useful. Well, in what way would their postcode be useful, and how would that be checked?
Yeah, so the postcode can be helpful in terms of identifying, as I said before, areas of deprivation. It doesn't automatically tell you that that consumer themselves is experiencing deprivation.
But aren't these supposed to be financial checks about individuals rather than financial checks about or a kind of generalised assumption about our constituents in a particular area, and whether or not they are, at risk of being a problem gambler?
It's important not for us not to try and separate out each element and as though it was the only thing happening. So you're looking at a combination of factors. When you look at the patterns of play research, which was very, very extensive, from memory, it was over 20%, somewhere around about a quarter of people who are gambling at a high level did live in areas of higher deprivation. So we know there is a risk factor association. But that is not the only thing we look at. In these sort of initial risk check point that we're talking about here of 20% of people, we're looking then at things like bankruptcy declarations, county court judgments. We're looking at higher
which
risk,
I think
which
the Secretary of State did refer
is
to.
individual.
Yeah.
But what we're talking about is you have to build an overall risk picture. So each thing on its own isn't something that you make a decision.
Would the postcode be checked? You said that the job title wouldn't be checked.
So it's likely a postcode would be, because actually when you open an online account, you have to provide your postcode in order to open that account. If that postcode didn't match with other information, then you would probably struggle to open that account in the first place.
What would happen if someone supplied a false postcode in one of those checks?
Then they wouldn't be allowed to open an account. Alongside money laundering requirements, for example, if you give false information, that's probably going to make it harder for you to open an account. One of the important things to note is that before we published these consultations, we did ensure that DCMS themselves confirmed to us that what we were consulting on was consistent with both the wording of the white paper and the intention of the white paper, and we will do that for every white paper related consultation.
So when the Secretary of State said in the House that people wouldn't be aware of any of this and that it would be frictionless and it would just be a check on their credit worthiness and so on, that was inaccurate.
No, I don't consider
was that incomplete information. Shall I put it that way?
No, I don't agree with that at all.
She didn't mention postcodes or job titles or anything like that when she said they wouldn't be aware of it in the vast majority of cases.
And I think if
how can you not be aware of it when you're asked your job title?
Well, because actually in most cases when an account is opened at the moment, consumers are asked for that information. It's unlikely they'll be asked for things that they're not already providing when they open an account. The whole point was
she said that 80% of people, and I did check it, she said 80% of people would have to do, and I quote, nothing at all. And then she said, and I quote, 20% having a simple check on whether they have a county court judgment against them.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Yeah.
So she didn't say anything about them being asked for their job title.
No, but in the same way, she didn't say in Parliament that they'd be asked for their name, but consumers do get asked for their name when they open an account.
It was incomplete information rather than inaccurate, is what you're saying, is it?
I don't think it would be fair. I think the Secretary of State not saying that a consumer would be asked for their name, I don't think...
But she gave... the reason I'm pursuing this, because I don't have a particular axe to grind on it, but I am interested in what ministers say to us in statements in the House of Commons, it was clearly meant to give the impression, and I'm not editorialising about whether they should be asked for their name or whether it should be checked or not, but she was clearly to give the impression that to the House that the only thing that would be required of nothing would be required of customers, I think, is the impression that they would be unaware of it, and that most people would just have a simple check on whether they have a county court judgment against them. But the impression was not given to the Commons that they would then be asked for their job title and their and it gives a whole new meaning to the phrase postcode lottery, doesn't it really? Because it's not an individual check at that stage, is it? It's actually a check on where you live.
Gambling operators are required to know who their customers are. So they will ask you, if you set up an account today, they will ask you for information so that they can identify you. So the Secretary of State didn't run through what happens when you open a gambling account, and I wouldn't have expected it to.
Why does it need to be in your consultation if this is information that's already
Because it's a question that the industry...
It's nothing additional to what's already happening, is what you're saying, is it?
Because what we're saying at the moment is it's not necessarily consistent. And so we've asked the question as to whether it would be helpful to make it consistent.
I don't have a gambling account, but if I set one up, would I be required to say I'm a Member of Parliament?
Well, as I said, because it's not consistently being asked, you might, you might not. We've asked the question, and it is a genuine question, as to whether you should. But just to be very clear, I am satisfied that what the Secretary of State said in Parliament is both accurate and complete.
Okay.
Thank you. Just more broadly, what assessment has the Gambling Commission made of the potential damage that the proposals in the White Paper will enforce upon the horse racing industry?
The department actually made its own assessment, which is an appendix to or an annex to the White Paper itself. So they made their assessment of what that might look like. In terms of the current position for the horse racing industry, the latest projections for the horse racing levy show the highest amount returned to the industry ever. And the BGC recently publicised that the largest amount of money from the gambling industry ever has been given to the industry. What we're talking about with the horse racing industry is the same as we're talking about with anything else, but the horse racing industry does have some different factors around it. So we're talking about 3% of accounts requiring an enhanced check. That is very similar to the level of gambling risk that we're concerned about. Horse racing gets 70% of its income from 1% of accounts, which is why it will have a natural concern about this. But in terms of an assessment of the overall impact of the White Paper, that would be for the department, because it's the department's White Paper, not the Gambling Commission's, and that was published. I don't know if you've got any further information on that.
Yeah, so I mean, for us, when we consult, what we need to take account of are the licensing objectives that are in the Gambling Act. And we appreciate that's a slightly narrower view than the wider public policy view that government as a whole will take in terms of the impact on things like racing and so on, which is why the White Paper published that assessment in one of its annexes.
Thank you. Giles.
Thank you. Yes, from what I've heard so far, it's a balancing act that you're performing all the time, because you've got to bring people with you, the gamblers and the operators. And before I go on to the safety of the actual games, which I want to talk about, something came up earlier when you were talking about the operators. Now, I visited a few of the betting shops, good old-fashioned betting shops in my constituency, and they tend to be sort of centres of community. They know who they're dealing with, and it's in the operator's interest to ensure the safety of their customers. And indeed, they do, and they have cups of coffee, and they note if old Fred is spending a bit much, and they know the conditions that the chap lives in. And talking about what Kevin Brennan was talking about his name, his postcode, and all of that, they know their customers well. Now, clearly, when we get into the online arena, this is far harder to do. Do you find the operators interested in knowing this about their customers? Are they with you on it?
You mean in terms of the safety and financial risk?
Yes, because clearly it's in their interest, I would imagine, to not exploit people if at all possible.
I mean, what the industry definitely doesn't want are difficult stories about people who've been harmed or have gone beyond their means. And that is pretty universal. I mean, people go about it in different ways, and they express their view in certain ways, but absolutely, it's not in the industry's interest. The industry has had a very bad press, which I think it brought upon itself for a long time with cases like this. So the industry, yes, is with us. There will be, though, differences of opinions in terms of how it should be done and what exactly it means. That's not unusual, but you're quite right. Between land-based and for the enhanced check, the checks we're talking about here, it's not applicable to betting shops. But in terms of their ability in a land-based venue to know their customers, then it's much greater. It does depend a little bit. So I visited a few betting shops very recently, and I was in a busy city centre, and one was next to a train station. So, of course, the people who come in, there was a mixture of regulars, but, when the football's on, they'll get lots of people they don't know. So that's when they have to have good policies and procedures and be on their toes, because actually there is a mixture of things going on in most betting shops now. People might think about it all over the counter. Actually, 50% of their income comes from the machines on one side of the wall. Another, maybe 30% comes from the self-service betting terminals, where there's very little interaction, and maybe about 20 to 30% variable, depending on the betting shop and community, will be over the counter. So actually the job in a land-based venue has changed quite a lot, particularly in the last few years.
And these operators are keen to work with you. You don't feel you're working against them. So you're part of a team here. Because going back to the evidence you get to Damien Green earlier, when talking about driving gamblers from legit sites to underground, you seem to think that this wasn't an issue. Yet, for instance, in China, since 1949, gambling has been totally illegal. And 30 years ago, I worked in China. I've never seen so many people gambling. So you've got to... There is a balance to be struck, surely.
Yes, absolutely. I think there's a big difference between jurisdictions where gambling is not permitted or regulated and the grey market. We're talking about a very, very liberalised market here. But in terms of, is the industry working with us? Yes. Yes, they are working with us, and we've had very sensible conversations. I think the high-quality responses I think we will get, particularly on financial risk, will come from some of the larger operators who will have invested heavily in their evidence base around this. That's what I expect to see. And from my conversations, and I speak to the large operators on a very regular basis, we have, as an organisation, we had 220 stakeholder engagements last year, the equivalent of one every working day. We have broad engagement, not just with the industry, but with other groups as well. And I think everybody has a broadly shared aim. People sometimes have very strong views about how that should be delivered. And your description of us being engaged in a balancing act is absolutely right. That is where we are all of the time. The reality is the vast majority of people who will gamble on a regular basis won't have any issue at all. But it is hard to predict who will.
Thank you. I just wanted to get that sort of aired, if you like. Thank you very much. I'd like to move on to product-level protections. So, online products are already subject to tests on randomness and fairness. Is it not possible to have those checks on safety as well before release?
So I'll come to Sarah in this in just a second. What I'd say first is actually there is a balance between product, person, place and circumstances. So actually the way people gamble and interact is normally a combination of those things. So how I would react to a particular game or a particular type of betting and how Tim might react can be very, very different. And it would be a mixture of how we are as people, the product itself, where we're doing it, when we're doing it, our financial circumstances and a whole range of other things. So if I just preface that and ask Sarah to expand.
Yeah, so in the Gambling Act review, the government did consider this question as to whether games ought to be tested for harmfulness. The white paper obviously rules it out, and I think that's consistent with the Commission's advice, which was based on the evidence which tells us the extent to which gambling harms arise from a combination of complex factors, as Andrew described. So you've got core product characteristics that can influence harm, so things like event frequency and features that do things like increase the speed of play, but also all those other factors around the person, so the circumstances they're in at the time, the number of activities they gamble on, the frequency and duration of play, and so on, as Andrew described earlier. So because of that kind of quite complex picture, it would be very difficult in a way that it isn't when you're testing for randomness and so on, to test for safety, because safety will look different for different people in different circumstances.
Have you not introduced frequency of plays on slots, for instance? I think it was 2011, 2.5 seconds between each spin, and now you're recommending 5 seconds, is it? So you are interested in the safety. And
yeah, absolutely. So because of that complexity, what we think is that it's important to get safeguards in place so that there are controls across the product, if you like. So what we've done already is in 2021 a piece of work introducing a whole load of controls around online slot products in particular, which include so we banned features that speed up play or give the illusion that the players somehow got control over the outcome when they haven't. We banned slot spin speeds in excess of 2.5 seconds. So that's the maximum speed it can go. And we banned features like autoplay. So this is where the player can essentially sort of disassociate from the play and not really be engaged. And again, we were concerned about the risks in that space. We've also required in those operators to make sure the customer is aware of what they're doing, so they have to now clearly display to players their total losses or wins and the time they've been playing for, so that there's a sort of consciousness about the gambling that's going on.
Have you seen results from these?
Yes, so we actually published in June, I think, an assessment of those changes that we made in 2021 to online slots, and those were quite encouraging, which is partly why I think we're now consulting for non-slot games on some kind of wider safeguards. So the findings from the 2021 changes, when we reviewed them, were that there was some evidence of reduced play intensity, if you like, on online slots products since those changes were introduced. No increase in staking activity, interestingly, in response to the limit on spin speeds in particular. That's quite interesting. And no evidence of a significant negative impact on the enjoyment of gamblers. So the things we're currently consulting on are a 5-second minimum game speed on non-slot online games. And again, removing those features that can speed up play, increase the intensity, again, to try and reduce the risk of harm to consumers.
This is all about the safety of the product, but you really don't feel, as a commission, that you can't do a safety assessment prior to the release of a game. Is that right, Andrew? Sorry.
I think for all the reasons I've described, it would be impractical. There's also a really important point about what we know about people who have problems with their gambling, which is they are more than likely to be gambling on more than one product. So that's why. So you get some quite odd things. I'm sure, when the committee has looked at some of the problem gambling rates.
Might it be possible to have a safety testing regime if you had more data from the gambling operators?
I think so. The approach we've taken is to get safeguards in place and, as ever, make sure our rulebook is really clear in terms of the outcome and the onus being on operators to make sure they're only releasing safe products into the market. So we expect them to do a lot of this testing.
Okay, all right. Thank you, Chair.
And finally, Rupa.
Hi, I want to ask some questions about advertising and then research, which we keep coming back to. So the Commission recommended that government ban gambling shirt advertising, front of shirt advertising in elite sports, and reduce the volume of gambling in sports stadiums generally. Were you surprised that government didn't follow this advice?
So I think I'll say a bit and Tim may want to join in. I think, so our advice was based on the evidence, and particularly in terms of exposure to more vulnerable people, particularly children associated with the Premier League. Government does have to balance a range of things. So our responsibility is around gambling and the licensing objectives. We are not required to make wider considerations in terms of the financing of football, for example. So government will have to factor those things in. Our advice is our advice. We felt that there should be changes made, and government made its assessment and has decided not to make those changes. Obviously, there is the voluntary agreement with the Premier League for front of shirt, but that was the decision that they took. Did you want to add to that?
Yeah, as Andrew said, I think there's a range of wider considerations that the government rightly needs to take into account that as a gambling regulator we don't need to take into account when we give our advice. We focus purely on the licensing objectives in the Act. I do think it's important, though, when you look at the white paper, there's actually a really comprehensive package of measures in the advertising space. So whilst a lot of the coverage focused upon sports sponsorship, the consultation that we've got live at the moment around restrictions on cross-selling, I think will make a real difference. I think similarly, the future work that we will be doing linked to the white paper as well around kind of incentives and bonuses is another area in that kind of advertising space that could make a real difference as well. So I think seeing these things as a package is really important.
We've talked about the fallibility of statistics, but we know that YouGov, their polling shows 60% of people think there's too much gambling advertising, around 77% within football alone. I mean, do you think gambling policy on advertising is being held to a higher standard than in other issues? So we know we've had Professor Heather Wardle speak to us, and she says that this causal connection, it's impossible to prove. And why are we even asking for this? Why is there such a high standard when it comes to gambling?
I think there are two issues there. One is public acceptability and whether people like it or not. So it's something that when I meet people I haven't seen for a while and we talk about where I work, they'll inevitably want to complain to me about the level of gambling advertising, although that's not actually in our remit. It is something that is in society not particularly popular. I think that is different to, as you make out, that causal link. So our advice was based on the available evidence. The white paper is a rare opportunity to explore this issue. And, we were clear, we felt there should be some reductions in this space. Is it held to a different standard to other things? I think that in the end is a political decision as to what people want to do with it, because you will sometimes struggle to have a truly definitive evidence base because these are complicated things. If you look at problem gambling overall, the circumstances can be extremely complicated and lots of different things can play a role, including advertising. We do know that people who have problems with their gambling are more likely to gamble when they see advertising. But drawing a causal link between the level of advertising and problem gambling is exceptionally difficult to do, as it is in lots of other areas.
And just on this subject of research, do you accept that the funding model of research on gambling is a bit messed up here? I mean, I know actually in your previous incarnation as the National Lottery Commission, you funded lots of good people's stuff out there. My previous office mate when I was an academic, Dr. Emma Casey, she's now at York. Her stuff on women doing the lottery, you funded that and people are grateful. But at the same time, you mentioned, Andrew and Tim, quite a few times this patterns of play research, which amongst the academic community seemed to be really problematic because the industry had their fingers all over it. So I think when it went out for tender, part of the promise was that the data set would be available for public good for all afterwards. It was online gambling companies for independent academics to analyse, but actually when the project finished, all that data was taken away. The people who worked with it were told they're not allowed to touch it again. I mean, it just looks a bit fishy that there is a huge paucity of genuinely independent scholars working in this area. They don't have access to the data. The industry controls it. What can you guys do to loosen things up there?
Well, I think the White Paper's decision to create the statutory levy is a big part of that solution. I think it's a very big part of that solution. And if the model is something along the lines of, for research, there is an independent research council that is used to commission and oversee that, I think that would be an excellent step forward. At the moment, you have different groups vying within the same area. It is difficult to get long-term funding. This is an area that we think is under-researched. Actually, I think probably research in this country is very good internationally in terms of the volume of it, but we don't think it is enough. So I think that is a big step forward with the statutory levy being used in this area. I think there will always be an argument about the data and access to it. I think some in the industry fear that data will be used by people who've made their minds up. So they're very cautious about the use of data, and others feel they can't get access to the data. The industry must be hiding something. And that's where I think having an independent research council and the right standards around it will help encourage more research, truly independent research, as you say, into the area of gambling. I think that can only really be a good thing. And at worst, it will tell us that some questions are difficult to answer or can't be answered. And that would be a step forward in itself.
I mean, Paul Blomfeld alluded to this as well, that now that the regulatory settlement fund's been closed, all that money's been hoovered up by Gamble Aware, and there are people who sort of, because of the industry influence, they feel that's not the appropriate vehicle, the right mechanism for this. Do you get the point being made there?
The money has not been hoovered up by Gamble Aware. We've set up a system stabilisation.
There are some organisations who may not want to engage with them because of their industry influence.
Well, I think it's as we said earlier, the Commission's not in a position to be a commissioning body for research. We weren't set up as one, we're a licensing body, and we don't have the resources or the funding to do that. A long-term solution is needed, which is what the statutory levy is about. People will make criticisms of Gamble Aware. I think some of those criticisms are unfair, but people will hold their view. The current funding model has relied very largely on industry funding, and there are people who will be unhappy with that. They will feel it's tainted, and they decide to not deal with different bodies. I think that is a view that people are entitled to hold. But I think the future lies in there being a more independent approach. So the model is based on a statutory levy where there should be no concern about the origins of the funding or any control, even if that assumption was misplaced.
And then just lastly, on consultation, I mean, these things are all interconnected. So the fact that there are so few independent academics in the area means that those who are stretched very thin. So there is an imbalance in these consultations that, your independent researcher working in a university with loads of students and other demands on them will be outgunned and outnumbered by the whole might of the industry. So, they have to be strategic and choose which consultations do they reply to. It's not something, when I was an academic, we had to account for every hour of our day. What were we doing? Funded research, independent research, teaching, marking, blah, blah, blah. So people like that are going to just fall through the cracks.
And the reassurance I would give is that when we consider consultation responses, we don't treat this like a kind of referendum or independence or a kind of a opinion poll. We don't weigh the responses on either side of the argument. We look at the quality of what's being provided. We look at the evidence base, the strength of that, the independence of it, and we supplement it with our own kind of research and data gathering as well. And I feel confident that actually when we've run consultations, that risk of perhaps one side of an argument outgunning the other doesn't really play into it. We may get a lot of responses on one side of the argument, but if they're not driven by clear, robust evidence, they are not going to carry as much weight.
If I could just add as well, I think our advisory groups that we've set up are really relevant in this space. So the gap, if you like, that you've articulated, I think is one we've recognised, and that's why we set up our advisory board on safer gambling, which brings together a whole load of experts, academics and others to help us understand what the evidence base is out there, and actually to generate some interest in the academic community, which is also important, I think. It's not a panacea for the issues you've described, but then we supplement that with advice from our other advisory panels. So we have one on lived experience, and we have a digital advisory panel as well, which is important in the context of the market we regulate. So I think that's also important, the things we're doing to kind of plug some of those gaps.
So going forward, what safeguards can you build into the statutory levy process that sort of all stakeholders are equal or to even the playing field?
And I think that's probably more of a question for DCMS, because they're leading on the setup of the statutory levy, and they will consult on it. We, based on Section 123 of the Gambling Act 2005, he says, in a proper yes minister moment, we will have to be consulted on that as per the Act. So we will give our views on how we think this should be structured. I do think, though, the general premise of the way that the levy's been described has those safeguards that you have, that independent research and funding to, I think, allow academics to be a bit more dedicated in this space. I spent 3 years working in a research-intensive STEM-intensive university.
Yes,
So,
yeah.
although academics would violently object to me describing myself as anything remotely close to an academic, but I have had to see the balancing act, and it is very difficult. The load between teaching and everything else, and you've got your ref submissions and all of that stuff. It does make it very difficult, particularly in an area where funding is harder to come by or is debated. So I think this is going to be a big step forward, but it will take time. It will take time to grow a community of people who are interested in this field and will come at it in the right way. And what we've set out in the evidence gaps and priorities work is where we see some of those very clear gaps that exist that do need that research. So that people aren't just starting from scratch. We're trying to guide people towards where we know there isn't as much information as we think we should have to try and assist with this. But you do need to have that funding framework in place, as has been necessary for any field of academic study.
Okay, thanks. No, it'd be good to have a champion from academia. Thanks.
Thanks, Rupert. Thank you all for your time today. Was there anything further you wanted to add before we allow you to escape?
Nothing on the content, but I'm going to embarrass somebody. There's a young man sitting behind me. It's his 18th birthday today, and he wanted to spend it in Parliament. So happy birthday to James, who's decided to come to Select Committee for his birthday, which is one of the more unusual 18th birthday celebrations.
Very unusual, and that is firmly on the record. Thank you very much, all of you, for your time today. We'll now bring in the second panel, please. Thank you.
That's funny.
Where did you spend your 18?
Not in a committee, I tell you that.
Where did you spend your 18?
Yeah, but I was art side, it's good then, humanities.
Yeah, no, have you had it?
No.
Good morning. Good morning. Our final panel, we're joined by the Right Honourable Stuart Andrew MP, the Minister for Sport, Gambling and Civil Society, and by Ben Dean, the Director of Sport and Gambling at the Department of Culture, Media and Sport. A warm welcome to both of you. Apologies for the delay in kicking off this second panel, and I would encourage both the committee and our witnesses to try and keep both the questions and the answers as concise and yet
Good luck with
that. Yet exciting as possible. I'm going to kick off the questions today, Minister. Do you consider gambling to be a public health issue?
So I think the treatment of gambling harm, yes, is. And I think it is important that we, and that's precisely, in fact, why we have published this white paper with the proposals to try and address many of those issues. It's been, as we all know, it's been 20 years since there's been a real systemic review, if you like, of gambling, and a lot has changed in that time. And so it is right and proper, I think, that we do that with that thought in mind.
But the head of the NHS's new gambling clinics told us he doesn't expect the white paper's reforms to lead to a decline in referrals. Does that concern you?
So I think this is the sort of thing that we'd obviously need to monitor, but I think there may be a number of reasons why that may be the case. For example, more centres opening sees more people seeking treatment, and I actually think that's probably a good thing. We want people to be able to come forward and seek the treatment that they need. I think also, hopefully, we can start to see a reduction in the stigma of people who are suffering with gambling harm. I think that's a really important that people feel they can talk about it, that they can seek the support that they need. We're keen to ensure that through the statutory levy there is, the treatment that is available, the education and the research will be an important element of how we tackle those harms.
Amy.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning. I'm struck that throughout this debate, I mean, not just our investigation, but the whole debate around gambling, there is a window of acceptability, which is basically how much tighter does the regulation need to be? What do we need to do? And yet, on the other side, we've had more than 100 letters sent to all members of the committee by the Racing Post of people basically saying, I'm an adult, I'm doing something legal, I can take decisions how to spend my own money, sort of butt out of my life. Do you have any sympathy with that view?
Look, exactly, and I think this is, I have to say, when I sort of first came into this role, it was clear to me that there are strong arguments on both sides of the debate. The first people I met were families whose stories were frankly devastating, and that stuck with me. But then there are a vast majority of people who do enjoy gambling in a safe way, and it isn't for us to tell them how they should spend their money. And I think what we're trying to do here is bring about a balanced and proportionate approach which addresses many of the changes that have happened in the gambling scene over the last 20 years, but also seeks to bring about a uniform approach amongst operators to identify, to have a process in place to identify those perhaps who are entering the risk of gambling harm.
One of the pieces of framing we've had during the course of this inquiry has been that is gambling more like alcohol or tobacco? From what you say, you're more at the alcohol end of the spectrum.
Yes, I think so, but I think I would also say that this needs a bespoke approach, because there's a tremendous amount of research into the effects of alcohol and of tobacco. There's probably less research in gambling, so it does need a slightly different approach. But in itself, alcohol is not something that can be instantly harmful. It's over a period of time. And so on that level, perhaps yes. But the potential to enter gambling harm could happen a lot quicker than with alcohol. So you see what I mean? I think there are some distinctions, and that's why I would say it needs a slightly different approach to just thinking about an alcohol approach.
And do you think we're behind the curve in that, for decades we've been regulating alcohol and tobacco? And do you think on gambling we're behind the curve?
I think we're probably behind the curve in terms of research, and I think this is why I think the introduction of the levy actually gives us a sort of generational change, if you like, in terms of the funding, and gives us an opportunity to have perhaps some of the best research in the world, so that we can identify what is the actual what are the issues that need to be addressed in this area. And that's what we've tried to do very much with this white paper, very heavy on being evidence-led on what data we have and what research we have available to us at the moment, to take that sort of sensible approach.
Just to add to that, I think the one thing that we know has fundamentally changed the system has been the introduction of the smartphone. So the fact that the last legislation was done in 2005, before smartphones were really around the country, that is where we really need to focus our efforts, because we know that is where a lot of the harm is being caused, because you can bet at the moment any amount of money any time of day.
And I'm interested, you emphasise research, because as it were on the other side, people are saying there's sort of death by consultation here, that you assembled a lot of evidence for the Gambling Act review, and now we're sort of going through the same ground again with the white paper. Is that in danger of delaying everything?
No, look, I understand that, and I've had that question put to me on a number of occasions. Yes, there has been extensive research going on and consultation in terms of the preparing of the proposals within the white paper, But I think it is right for us to consult on the detail of those proposals that we are bringing forward, not least for a number of reasons. I think we want to make sure that we get it right, and I know that there's been a lot of coverage on various issues within a number of those proposals. It's important that we do get that right, and so take the time to consult. But equally, we have to do what is expected of us. If we don't, then there is a risk potentially of legal challenge, and that would further delay, and that's the last thing I want. Is keen for us to get these done. We are committed to delivering the majority of these by the summer of next year, and we're working hard to progress that.
I mean, some of them will require primary legislation, and I'm not going to ask you the standard question about will it be in the King's Speech, because I know what the answer is. I may have given it in my time. So, but will there be, if there is a requirement for primary legislation, does the requirement for consultation act as a barrier to that? Will it delay, or will you be in time to introduce any primary legislation that may be required?
I think the approach we've taken here is looking at what we can do to, rather than just having one new gambling bill, let's do this in an approach that can deliver the changes that are necessary, whether that be through voluntary introduction, whether that be through secondary legislation, or through the Gambling Commission. But we will bid, where we think that we need primary legislation. But as you rightly say, I don't know whether we will secure that. It's going to be a very busy session.
You are bidding for gambling legislation?
We will be, yes.
I think what I would add is, I think what we know is really important is in terms of the main measures that will actually have an impact on the ground in trying to address the harm we want, we can do most of that without primary legislation. So when you look at the statutory levy, online slots, financial risk checks, setting up an ombudsman, some of the land-based reforms we're talking about, and safer game design, all of those we are confident we can take forward without primary legislation, and clearly do so quickly.
Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you very much. Can I talk to you about the statutory levy and the way it's going to be administrated, and how it's going to be delivered and distributed? What will be the role of the department in all of that, and how do you assess the quantum of funding that's going to need to be raised in order to deliver on all the commitments and aspirations?
So, in terms of the sort of administration of that, that's exactly what we're sort of consulting on at the moment. We want to know what is the best way to maximise, if you like, the opportunities of what is fundamentally a major change in how we are funding some of these services and some of these the research and the education. And that's something that we're really keen to focus on, make sure that we get that right, because there are a lot of organisations that haven't touched the voluntary levy, as you will well know, and so we want to ensure that we do, I suppose, maximise the opportunities that this presents to us. We will consult on what is, we think what is the best way for this to be administered. There will be roles for other departments, so for Department for Health and Social Care being the lead department in the provision of treatment will be important for us to work very closely with them, and we have done. And so that's why we were keen to get that consultation out as quickly as we can, and that will come in soon.
So you see the Health and Department of Health and Social Care having a role in the way that it's...
We haven't made a decision on that yet. We're genuinely wanting to listen to those consultations, to read that, what comes back, because there have been a number of scenarios presented to me, and also, we know that a lot of the services that are provided at the moment are provided by the third sector. There's a lot of expertise there that we would not want to lose. So it is, genuinely a need for us to understand what would be the best model.
What sort of role do you see for Gamble Aware and the National Gambling Support Service having once the statutory levy is implemented?
That's why I mentioned them. I would hate us to lose the expertise that they have. I've had regular meetings with Gamble Aware CEO. And I think that's exactly what we want to do. How do we create a really effective model in terms of the administration of the levy, making sure the treatment is available, for those who need it in all parts of the country, that the education is, which I think is a really important piece of work, educating about how to gamble safely. again, is something we need to design. So it's getting the best people to help us provide the best services is what we're consulting.
I think one of the things we recognise is a huge amount of the provision is from that third sector, and we definitely wouldn't want to lose that expertise. So one of the things we've been working on is making sure we have a smooth transition and they don't have funding that falls off a cliff or anything dangerous like that.
Given the number and the extensiveness of the consultation that's happening, to what extent are you satisfied that the provisions that have been put in place in the interim are going to leave the current services fully funded and able to carry out all their responsibilities?
Yes. So having come from the third sector myself, I know how difficult it can be when you have this sort of uncertainty around defunding, and it was something I raised directly with industry. They've committed to continue in this interim period, plus the Gambling Commission have made available to Gamble Aware £33 million. So I'm confident that we have got sufficient support there in the interim, but it will be something I'm very mindful of and will continue to monitor throughout this period.
Thanks very much, Chair. And perhaps I can follow up straight away on that point. And I think there are a couple of issues about which we've explored with the Gambling Commission about their decision to put the regulatory settlement money in the hands of Gamble Aware during the transitional period. When the first, they've given us reassurances that they don't see that as in any sense framing what the future architecture might look like, and I assume that you'd agree with that.
Very much so, yes, and exactly. We want to literally get this consultation there, get the best ideas forward.
It does, and thank you for that. But it does leave a question, and Mr. Dean kind of alluded to it, about how during this transitional period, those organisations which the department has drawn on heavily for advice and support in developing the white paper are going to receive funding because they're organisations that aren't on the red list that won't accept industry money. So do you think that there needs to be some framework within which we can guarantee continued support for those groups in the third sector?
Do you mean in the future or
during the transitional period?
During the transition? Yeah, I mean, I think this is something that I am extremely mindful of. I don't want us, whilst we are in this transitional period, to see any of those organisations that are delivering really important work to find themselves in a really difficult position. And that's why it was almost, we literally invited in industry. I have to say they were very open to, committing to making sure that there wouldn't be a problem within that period. But I think this additional 33 million should help as well.
Yes, no, I mean, we've had explicit meetings with industry, as the Minister said, and they are maintaining their voluntary commitments until the statutory levy is in place. And I think that is vital to make sure we do have that funding certainty.
I mean, my question was more seeking assurance that all parts of the third sector would continue to receive funding, because traditionally some of the groups you've leaned on for support haven't taken money through Gamble Aware.
Well, I mean, if they haven't taken money from Gamble Aware, I couldn't
guarantee. They've taken regulatory settlement money,
yes,
as opposed to industry money.
From industry, apart from not from the voluntary. Yes, I get your point. I'd have to probably have a look at and do a bit of an assessment of who we might be talking about and what the level of support is. But this is something that has been directly raised with me by Gamble Aware and other charitable organisations. So we're literally on it, as it were, because I'm very conscious of the potential problems.
Yeah, that's very helpful. If I could ask one other question. I mean, we talked about, the Chair opened the discussion on talking about how gambling is a health issue, and you rightly said, talked about gambling harm. At the extreme end of gambling harm is addiction and those who have taken their lives. And I know you mentioned the impact that testimony from families had on you. The Office of Health Inequalities and Disparities has concluded that there were between 117 and 496 additional suicides related to gambling every year, something like approaching 10% of all suicides. And I guess you'd accept that assessment. Do you think we do enough currently to learn from those deaths? Because much of the focus has been on one or two striking cases which have had coroner's inquests, but the majority of deaths don't.
I mean, I think the first thing I'd say is that, you know, as I mentioned a few moments ago, that, you know, meeting those families has been incredibly difficult, and that is why, you know, we are keen to make sure that we try and do what we can to ensure that we have a better understanding of the issues that many people who are facing gambling harm face. In terms of the recording of suicides, I have to be honest, I don't think we as a government have actual definitive information that would say that, you know, X amount of suicides are a result of gambling harm. There will be, in some cases that will have been a cause, but there will be potentially other reasons as well. And I think this goes back to the point that we need greater research in this area, in these sorts of areas, to really understand this important piece of work. We want to be able to have much better research and evidence so that we can continue the approach we've already taken, which is very much evidence-led. And where evidence and research where research shows that there's evidence that there needs to be more work done in an area, we will be more than happy to do that.
These clearly they are very complex cases when it does happen. But at the heart of what we are trying to do through the white paper is reduce that harm. And I think the measures we are taking, things like the financial risk checks and stuff like that, are all about trying to prevent that harm taking place. And it is extremely difficult in those cases, but that is what we are aiming to achieve.
I appreciate that, and I'm kind of guessing you're not actually challenging the OHID numbers, because they gave a fairly broad range, didn't they? It's a fairly exhaustive piece of research.
I don't think it's helpful to get into... the research is the research, and they've used the best available evidence. It was based on, I think, a Swedish study and extrapolated up. So, you know, there are caveats around all data, but at its heart, what we recognise is that there are suicides linked to gambling, and that is what the harm that we are trying to address.
I mean, I guess I was raising the point more to kind of raise a wider issue, which is how we learn from those deaths and how we draw from the experience of families. And I know you've talked, obviously, about that, and the Secretary of State acknowledged that when she introduced the white paper to the Commons. One of her predecessors, the current Deputy Prime Minister, said that there should be a role for those with lived experience on the Gambling Commission. Would you agree with that?
I think it's worth saying, so that was something we were heavily engaged with Gambling Commission at the time. They have set up a lived experience group who now have a formal role within the Gambling Commission, and that is something that we have welcomed. And I think it's really important those voices do get heard in the Gambling Commission.
And a clear voice for those with lived experience in whatever the new architecture is.
My understanding is that lived experience group is operational in the Gambling Commission and will continue to be so.
Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Rupert.
Hi. Is there in some ways a kind of contradictory aim or ambition that you guys have got in this white paper? Because on the one hand, you're encouraging growth and innovation and the economic contribution of the sector, but then on the other hand, you want to protect people from risks and harms. And at the same time, there is this rankle that central government's never really taken ownership of the national strategy to prevent gambling harms. So sort of other national strategies have got targets and outcomes and all those sort of things, whereas this one feels like you've subcontracted it away to the Responsible Gambling Strategy Board and then the Gambling Commission. It just seems a bit unsatisfactory what's going on here. How do you reconcile all this?
Well, I think you do rightly raise this this complex area of work where gambling is something that a lot of people, as I said at the beginning, do enjoy. They do enjoy it safely. It is an industry that employs an awful lot of people in this country and makes a significant contribution to the exchequer. And so, that safe and responsible gambling is something that we are obviously wanting to help, but we've got to ensure equally that there are those checks in place to ensure that we are reducing the risk of people falling into gambling harm. Now, at the moment, the checks there's an obligation on operators to do checks, but what we're seeing is that there's different approaches to those checks, and so it's not a very consistent field, and that's why in our proposals we will introduce that so that all of those operators will have the same approach to doing those financial risk checks and ensuring that those people that we need to identify are identified and offered the support that they may need at an earlier stage.
I think it all comes back to balance. So when I think about my other hat as Director of Sport, and the Minister is obviously Minister for Sport, and we've just launched a sport strategy which is all about getting people, we just want people to do more sport and get more active. With gambling, it is about that balance the Minister talked about. 40% of the population gamble every month, and the vast majority of them do so safely and happily, and we have to recognise that it is their money to spend how they see fit. But what we really want to focus in on is that 1% roughly of the population who are problem gamblers and those who are at risk of harm, and that roughly 1% has been pretty stable over 20 years, and this white paper is about really trying to do all we can to reduce the impact of those at risk and those suffering gambling harms.
Would you ever set outcomes? Because at the moment it feels like progress can't be measured if it's all so vague.
I think what we're trying to say is we want to see that 1% of people who are suffering harm addressed, and we want to see that minimised as far as possible. We haven't set a specific figure on it, but that is what we are aiming to do.
I mean, in Australia and Canada, and they've got tons of research that backs this up, they've actually made sort of lower risk gambling guidelines, and it's things like you shouldn't do it 4 times a week. I think there's specific sort of measurable outcomes they've got. The Canadian website, I can send it round, it says, right, okay, you shouldn't gamble more than 1% of your household income, not more than 4 times a month, and not regularly on 2 types of game. I mean, is there stuff we could learn from there and cut and paste?
So one of the things we
do
look closely at is what we call the markers of harm. So what are the signals that would identify that you may be suffering gambling harm? And that's something that the Gambling Commission work very closely with the industry on. What are the best markers of harms to identify those problem gamblers? And when those markers go up, making sure that industry are then making appropriate interventions. So if you are playing at unusual times of day, if you are chasing your losses, if you are losing excessive amounts, those types of markers of harm are absolutely where we would then want to see interventions happening.
And I mean, encouragingly, you said more research is needed, that's a given. What role is the government playing to encourage more research into gambling and gambling harms? And also the type of research, if it's industry funded, there's always suspicions around it. They're very sort of, they hog their data for themselves. They're very protective over that. How can we improve the picture?
Yeah, well, I think this is where the introduction of a statutory levy means that there will be... Well, first of all, we're working with UKRI in terms of, what are the research programmes that we need. But I think because we now will have a statutory levy, we may well see other organisations wanting to come on board and provide that research to us and accept that funding where they wouldn't have before. And it will enable us to, commission independent research that people can have confidence in. And as I said earlier, where that research provides evidence where we may need to address other issues, then we will obviously look at that very carefully. And if we think that evidence is compelling and action is needed, then we would look at doing so.
Yeah, it's a bit vague again how that money is going to be distributed after the.
Well, because that's exactly why it will be part of the consultation. That's we are going to ask as part of that consultation how that money should be distributed, what are the level of income that is needed. And so that will be very much, we will consider the responses to that consultation when we then develop how we will...
What we hope people will feel confident about is, firstly, where people were being unwilling to take money from industry, it addresses that problem. And secondly, it will give us long-term funding so that we can set in place things like longitudinal studies that are needed to really monitor this over many years to come.
And the international comparisons, you'd look at those too. I mean, maybe some of those are replicable. Again, longitudinal, as you say, you need to track cohorts over a long period, not just... Because the way current funding cycles work is you get a 5-year project or whatever, or 5 is a lot, actually.
So we fully recognise that we do need long-term funding and we do need some of those long-term programmes. I think, as the Minister said, the very reason we want to consult on it is to get people's views on it and make sure we are engaging those who have the expertise before we finalise the plans on it.
Okay, so at some point this will be as well researched, as you mentioned at the beginning, tobacco, alcohol, those things. There's loads more research than there is on gambling out there. So that's okay. And I'd make a plea for independent academics as well, because I said to the last panel, they don't even have the time to respond to the consultations because they're so overstretched. Okay, good. It also feels like this white paper is talking a lot about sort of encouraging land-based gambling, whereas at the same time we recognise things like slot machines, especially for kids, they're a magnet for increasing all these harms that we're trying to prevent. That, again, has raised eyebrows.
Yeah, well, I think it's because we're trying to, for want of a better word, level the playing field a bit, because, you know, the costs that a lot of the land-based industry face, there are significant costs that they have to address compared to, say, online providers. And so to give them a fighting chance, because they are important employers in local areas as well, that's why we've put those recommendations in there, and we're consulting on that consultation now.
I think the white paper was always a balance, and I think, again, going back to what I said about when the last legislation was done in 2005, back then clearly the main form of gambling was people going into land-based premises, whereas now it is all online, and we recognise online needed tightening. We felt with land-based, actually there are rules which are just quite outdated. Some of the ratios which made sense in 2005 don't really make sense in the modern age where you have machines that play multiple games. So there are some areas where we are changing the rules so that they can operate effectively. So, I mean, a very good example is in casinos you sometimes have very restrictive rules, which mean you have a load of machines that have to be turned on but aren't being used, and then queues of people waiting for other machines, and actually just giving them more freedom to decide what ratios are needed, still within some rules, will help ensure that they operate more effectively.
Okay. I also want to ask a little bit about advertising. We know £1.5 billion a year is spent on gambling advertising, and all the polling shows it's actually quite unpopular. People don't like these pop-ups every time they're trying to do something on the internet, flinging Foxy Bingo or whatever at them. Again, why did the government not go further in curbs on gambling advertising? For example, front of shirt advertising. It would have been an easy win. It's popular with the public. I think people are surprised that no further action is being taken when everyone accepts that advertising influences increased consumption, and increased consumption equals increased harms.
I think, again, it's important to point out that we went on an evidence-led approach on this. So we looked at the types of advertising that may potentially lead people into gambling harm. So that is direct. It's also important to say that actually some changes have been happening in this area. Some rules have been tightened up. But we have gone very much on the evidence. There's little evidence that exposure to advertising alone causes people to enter into gambling harm, although we do recognise, of course, that it can perhaps disproportionately affect those that are going through gambling harm. But there is clear evidence that the sort of personalised direct marketing can pose a risk, and that's why a number of changes have been made in those areas. But again, once we have the research, if there's more evidence that proves that advertising is causing harm, then we will look at that. The Secretary of State made that point when we introduced the white paper to the House. She was very clear on that.
Going back, we said all along we would be led by the evidence, and whilst we did have people asking us to do blanket bans on all advertising, as the Minister said, the evidence wasn't there that the harm was there linked to general advertising. But we have, I think it's important just to note what we have done. So we have, we have bans of aggressive targeting practices. The Gambling Commission have taken action on VIP schemes and reduced the number of VIP customers by 90%, and they're consulting on further work on bonuses and free bets. The advertising code has also been tightened, so you're not allowed to particularly appeal to children. You mentioned the Premier League have taken voluntary action to remove shirt sponsorships of gambling companies at the end of the 25-26 season. 20% of gambling advertising has to be safer messaging, which is an industry commitment. And we've also working with industry and gambling about a sports code around better social responsibility around these areas. So there is quite a lot of action being taken that was backed by the evidence we found.
And it just feels, if you're looking for a direct causation, this made this happen, that's going to be impossible to prove. You've got correlation. Correlation is not causation. You know, if you're setting yourself that bar, it's impossible. You're never going to meet that did not make that directly happen. So it's a vicious cycle, it feels.
Well, if your question is your question, should we have banned all advertising?
I think that if you're saying there is no direct causation, therefore we're not going to do anything, because you've not acted at all, not just,
No, that's not true.
I've just listed 6 things that we are doing.
Voluntary things other people have taken in spite of.
No, they're not all voluntary. So the VIP schemes that the Gambling Commission have cracked down was not voluntary. The work that the Advertising Standards Authority have done is not voluntary. A lot of this is not voluntary.
I think it's slow. Okay, last one from me. Do you accept that sort of gambling in a way exists on the spectrum? People can move in and out of these behaviours. I think that the person from the Commission, Sarah, was saying that people can use more than one product. And when we sort of measure these things in these ways, we're ignoring things like, I think problem gambler is a very problematic term because it puts all the personal responsibility on the individual, and we're ignoring structures of inequality, things like class and gender and all these things. I'd like to see this future research that comes in this new framework looking at intersectionality more, because at the moment it's all very stats-based and it's all the person's fault. Would you accept that?
I don't think we would ever say it's the person's fault. I think there are a number, this is a complex area of how people find themselves in some of the positions.
Personal responsibility is what I mean. Often it's a very easy get-out clause if you just shove everything.
I don't think we would say that, actually, because there is an obligation on operators to do the sorts of checks. I think the problem is there's an inconsistency in the approach of doing those checks and identifying, and that's why we're trying to bring about a consistent approach so that industry knows what is expected of them, and that therefore we can sort of identify those people who are at danger of entering gambling harm, but at the same time allow all those people who want to carry on enjoying gambling to do so. It's their, as part of their how they wish to spend their money.
Yeah, we could go on and I will end here, but just sometimes putting non-gamblers in these same statistics also conflates the picture. So that's why it looks not as bad as it is, whereas with some products it can be 1 in 6 people get addicted. So I think the way we collect the statistics is wrong.
What we definitely recognise is that there is a spectrum of harm, and there is also a spectrum of products that cause harm, and that is very much one of the things we've tried to look at through our review. So we know, for example, that the main national lottery draw has a very low forms of harm compared to online slots, and that's very much why we are trying to take targeted interventions on where the harm really lies.
Thanks, Rupert. Just going back to the what you just said, Minister, about the fact that the vast majority of people do enjoy gambling safely. It occurred to me, do you think that the Gambling Commission lived experience panel should include those who do enjoy gambling safely and have never had any health issues from it?
That's a really interesting point, actually. I don't know if they do. Do they have?
One of the things, I don't want to speak on their behalf, but I know one of the things they have heard and they are considering is around, they have seen the value of having that lived experiences group, but they also recognise there is a body of people who, as you say, sort of are just normal gamblers or people who have been engaged in the industry. They may not be sort of industry representatives, but come from that side of the debate as well. And I know it is something they are looking at about how they engage that side and whether there is more they should be doing to make sure they are hearing a balanced view from both sides of the argument.
Just picking up on Rupert's questions, I'm sorry, I'm just scooping up a few things that have just popped into my head while I've been listening. I'll go back to Rupert's question on advertising. One of the things occurs to me, despite the fact that actually female gamblers are much smaller cohort of the sort of problem gambling sector, there is a massive growth in the number of women who are gambling, particularly online. Does it concern you, the number of TV ads for online bingo that are really specifically and quite robustly targeted towards females?
I think, again, this is why we want this research funding, because it will help us to really understand in greater detail any impact, if there is, on precisely the issue you raise. But I think I think the thing that has made me feel comfortable about what we've done with the white paper is that it has been evidence-led, and you can point to evidence, and that's quite important when you're dealing with two sides of a very difficult debate at times, and being able to say that we have taken this approach because the evidence has led us in this direction. And if we can have more research that will look at exactly the points you raised, and it does identify that is causing a problem, then yes, as I committed earlier, we would look at that.
I think that one of the key advantages we see is that statutory levy is, as well as the research the Minister has talked about, if there are identifiable areas, as you've set out, then we can also look into the prevention element, as well as if bespoke treatment is needed as well.
June.
Thank you, Chair. And good afternoon, as we are now. I want to move on to some of the checks being proposed for online gambling accounts. We've heard that the enhanced financial risk checks may miss some people experiencing harm at lower levels of gambling spend. Why did you not propose lower thresholds for triggering these checks?
I think, again, a lot of this was around the evidence that was available to us, looking at, I can't remember the figure, but it was a significant number of bets that happened over the previous year. It was, I've forgotten the figure, but I can perhaps write to the committee with it. And it was through that, I think, that sort of brought us at the level that we were. Were you looking at
the levels of money impacted by it, or were you looking at the numbers of people affected, or what actually determined how you did it?
It's been a bit of both, and I think it's important to say this is a consultation. So again, one of the things we want is to get further input from people and further evidence. But when you break down how much each account wins or loses, I think it's quite helpful to understand. So broadly, 20% of accounts win in any given year. You have about 50% of accounts who lose under £100 in a year. About 20% of accounts lose between £100 and £500 in a year, and about 10% lose more than £500. And you're absolutely right that you can have harm at lower levels, but what we are trying to do is get a proportionate balance, so the vast majority of people won't be impacted by this, but those where we know there is most likely to be harm will have to go through the checks, but those checks will be, for the vast majority of people, frictionless.
And how will they be frictionless?
Well, that's exactly what we are consulting on at the moment. I want to make it very clear, because I've seen lots of discussion about this in the press, and they want to be clear why we're doing this. It is so that there is a consistent approach that industry will follow. designed to identify those who are at risk. We don't see the case that we have seen a nurse who was allowed to spend £245,000 in 3 months, or somebody spending 70,000 in 10 hours. We are working with agencies across the board to ensure that these checks are frictionless. So for 8 out of 10, they'll just they will just carry on as they do now. There will be then a percentage will have an enhanced check, and for many of those it will just be they'll be able to carry on. Even of the 3% that will need to do even more detailed checks, the percentage of those who would have to that will be facing frictionless checks will be high. I want to be really clear on this, that we want to make sure that this system works, and we will, if necessary, pilot this to make sure that it's working, and only when we are confident that it has delivered the frictionless tests that we have envisaged will we then look at rolling it out.
If we look at the conduct of the more enhanced checks, will gambling companies need customer consent to carry those out?
It's quite likely that customers may have to tick a box to consent to it. So what this is being devised at the moment, but what we have talked about and what the Gambling Commission are looking at in their consultation is saying at that basic check, it may be something like comparing records against whether or not you've been made bankrupt, do you have county court judgments against it, open source data sets like that. At the enhanced check, as the Minister talked about, that is where we are likely to rely more on things like credit checks and stuff, which again can happen instantaneously, can happen frictionless, other than just the customer may have to just tick a box, or it may be part of the terms and conditions. That's still to be determined.
And how will you ensure customers' financial profiles are not affected by the enhanced checks, and how their data is going to be protected?
That is something that I know the Gambling Commission and we have been talking to the Information Commissioner's Office about to make sure that those protocols are in place.
So you don't yet know how that's going to happen? That's still in discussion?
So the plans are still being consulted on and are being discussed, but that is absolutely the aim.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Kevin.
Thank you very much, and welcome both. Is this the favourite part of your brief, Minister?
That's, I think it's the most challenging, if I'm honest.
We had some interesting exchanges earlier on about the statistics that get bandied around this, and we've had some more now during your session. I suggested maybe it might be a case for the excellent Tim Harford and Radio 4's More or Less programme to dig into our inquiry. Would you go along with that?
Well, look, I think I've mentioned this a number of times now, but I do think that, in all seriousness, the introduction of a statutory levy does present us with a real opportunity to get first-class research. And, when you have that research, it will provide us with absolute evidence, and that's what I will be focusing on.
We had a letter from the Gambling Commission, actually, and it's been highlighted just now in our exchanges, about the OHID. Ben, you referred to earlier on the OHID report, and it says in their letter, we've even seen this figure extrapolated to say 10% of suicides in the UK are due to gambling. This is not a reliable or accurate way to use the range published by OHID. What's your response to that?
I think this goes back to what we were talking about earlier, that when you're looking at something very tricky like suicides, we recognise the importance of doing all we can to reduce suicides. We don't have the evidence at the moment to know exactly how many suicides are. As you said, there is some research out there, but that was based on, as I mentioned, a Swedish study and extrapolated. So it isn't, clearly in our ideal world we'd have better quality evidence, and that's exactly what the Minister is talking about, trying to get from the statutory levy.
Okay, and Ben, would you describe this as a significant policy intervention? You did say earlier on it's the first time in nearly 20 years that this has been looked at.
The white paper as a whole?
Yeah.
Yes.
So my question would be, to follow up to that to the Minister, is if it is such a significant policy intervention, with a large industry, there's lots of implications for health matters we've heard about, for employment, for tax revenue, and so on for the government. So why isn't it worthy of an impact assessment?
Well, I think the
government does impact assessments on,
Yes.
I turn up. I'm required by the whips to turn up to all these little statutory instrument committees, and I always read the impact assessment because that's where you actually find out the what's really going on. But so why isn't there an impact assessment on this very important major policy intervention?
I mean, I think that I probably need to come back to you, if I'm going to be really honest with you, Mr. Brennan, and to the committee with respect, because I wouldn't want to sort of give any misinformation.
I get a bit fed up with ministers actually saying they need to come back to me when I ask about impact assessments.
Right, okay.
Because, it's, well, look,
your point.
This is a huge thing, and yet the government doesn't deem it worthy. And I think Ben was looking for some in-flight refuelling, is now itching to tell me what he's found out.
Yes,
so.
right. I was just checking, but we did do an impact assessment for the online slots consultation that came out.
You haven't done it for this?
When you say this, which bit are you referring to?
The white paper.
The white paper. So, well, we did publish as part of the white paper the overall impact we think it would have on GGY.
It's not the same as a formal government impact assessment, as you well know.
We are publishing the best data we can.
Are you going to publish a proper impact assessment at some point as a government?
Well, we have the more detailed consultation, as I said, on online slots.
What discussions did you have about whether or not you should publish an impact assessment in relation to this major policy intervention that you just agreed this is?
What we're trying to balance is being as transparent as we can to publish the information we can, but also...
If you've been as transparent as you can, you'll have a full impact assessment.
Well, hang on. But also, as one of the main criticisms we have had is being able to move on to make actual impact on the ground. And so what we didn't want to do is hold up further the white paper by having a really detailed impact assessment, when actually what people want is us taking the white paper out and actually having an impact on the ground, which is the main criticism.
The white paper was held out because basically, ministers couldn't agree on publishing it for about a year. They could have done the impact assessment during that period of time, couldn't you? Yeah. Well, I just find it staggering that there isn't one anyway. That's all I was going to say. Did you hear the questions earlier on, and Julie Elliott asked some questions as well about affordability checks. Are you content, Minister, that what is being proposed in the consultation by the Gambling Commission squares up with the message that the Secretary of State gave us in April on the floor of the House?
Yes, I think it will bring out what we're seeking in terms of the structure of the model that we're looking for. And that's why I was very clear earlier on that, we when we say we want these frictionless tests, we mean it. The last thing I want to see is those who are who are enjoying gambling in a safe manner and in a way that they have done for many years to be impacted. So, but once this consultation, once we've got this consultation concluded, then we'll obviously look at all of the detail that is submitted, but that will be that is exactly what we are seeking to achieve. We're very clear on that.
I've raised this matter, another matter, previously when we had our inquiry into the National Lottery on this committee. Why isn't the lottery included in the white paper?
Because they're basically established under a separate piece of legislation. I think it's important to recognise that National Lottery contributes significantly to good causes in this country. And
it's still possible, isn't it, to buy a lottery ticket? Ben referred earlier on to the main lottery draw, which actually, as we know, isn't the whole picture about the issue about potential gambling harm with the lottery. It's still possible, isn't it, technically, to buy a lottery product with a credit card.
You fairly raised this, I think, last time I was in
front
of you.
Yeah.
And on the back of that,
I'm sure you remember.
I very much remember. And I took it seriously, and we went away and looked at it myself. And you are, as I said at the time, you are right that you can, using a credit card in a shop, buy a lottery. What we have banned is you can't use a credit card on the National Lottery app or online, but if you're
going to buy a Mars bar,
if you're in a shop, what we made a conscious decision of, and this was having talked to retailers, is what customers don't want and what retailers don't want is to have to do two checkouts, essentially, where someone would be buying their groceries and then have to use a separate card. And what we have also looked at is, do we have any evidence that there is harm being caused by people using credit cards for National Lottery purchases? And at the moment, we have no evidence that there is harm. It is under 1% of transactions. And should that change, and we see that there is harm, then clearly that is something that
and we've talked a lot about evidence, and I absolutely agree we should look at what the evidence is. Why isn't the lottery being included in the statutory levy?
I think because, as I say, the contribution they make to society is significant, and also there is a voluntary contribution that
so they do contribute voluntarily.
0.0.
They do have
0.01%.
They do have
of their gross gambling yield.
They do have statutory obligations about player protection that they have to follow. As I mentioned earlier, the main draw in particular is at the lower end of the
spectrum. They contribute less than £500,000 out of £3.5 billion.
They also contribute currently about between 1.6 and 1.8 billion a year to good causes.
Yeah.
And that's sports, heritage, culture, arts, voluntary organisations up and down the country. And we believe that combination of their good cause returns and their voluntary contribution
isn't this an opportunity now that there's a new
proportionate.
operator to actually encourage them, if you're not going to make it part of the statutory levy, to encourage them to contribute more towards the gambling harms charities and so on than they are currently? As I said, it's they're obviously required by statute to do what they do in terms of their good causes and so on, but on the gambling side, wouldn't they I think it's just less than £500,000, am I right? Is my figure right when I was looking that up? Couldn't they be doing more?
We believe what they're currently doing is proportionate and balanced, given the 1.6 to 1.8 billion of good cause returns as well, and given the amount of harm that is caused by the National Lottery. So we think it is about right. I mean, clearly, if they chose to put more in, then we would always welcome that.
Finally, should their adverts have more safer gambling messages in them than they do? Because I don't see much evidence of that. I see a lot of adverts from betting companies saying you should gamble responsibly, but I don't see it on lottery adverts.
Yeah, I think it probably goes back to the point that that there isn't significant evidence to show that National Lottery results in people falling into gambling harm. But it's an interesting proposition, and I'm not making any commitments here, but I'll certainly have a look at that.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chair. Just if I may just take you briefly to the GGs before we finish. So you'll know that the horse racing industry has expressed concern about the impact of the financial risk checks, and just wonder, just coming back to Mr. Brennan's point about impact, just wonder what your views are, the impact of the white paper on the horse racing industry, and if you could just update us on your review of the horse race betting levy, which you promised to conduct by 2024, so presumably by the end of the Parliament. Could you update us on those two things, Minister?
Yes, so, I mean, again, look, I personally, the Department, the government recognises the massive contribution that horse racing makes to this country. I mean, it's the second biggest spectator sport in the UK. There is no way we want to do anything to harm that. That's just why, yes, we are bringing in these checks, but we want them to be as frictionless. We want them to be that standard approach throughout. And so, but at the same time, we have launched the review into the horse race betting levy. We've had representations from both the British Horse Racing Association and from the Betting and Gaming Council. We've sort of encouraged them to come together. There've been some recommendations by BHA that we are currently considering, but we have also said to the two to sort of get together and come up with some proposals, and we even extended a deadline to allow that to happen, because I'm really keen that we take this opportunity to try and plug the gaps where we can and ensure that we secure a good future for horse racing in this country. There's a lot that we can be very proud of with the horse racing industry in terms of its reputation around the world, and and keen for that to happen. But we will, we're sort of using this as an opportunity to do the two hand in glove, as it were.
And in terms of what's come up then so far, have you been taken by any suggestions? Because I mean, I think I'm right in saying that you estimate the reduction in online horse betting, the gross gambling yield, between 6 and 11%. So to mitigate that loss is why you decided to undertake the review of the horse race betting levy. So has anything come up, Ben or Minister, that you've been taken with?
I think I would say the review is ongoing, so I don't want to sort of preempt what comes out of it. But we, as the Minister said, I think the two sides talking and coming collectively, we are seeing them next week, I think is really important. But one of the things we also recognise is the levy brought in, or is on track to bring in about 99 million in 2022-23. We haven't had the final figures through, but that would be the highest amount the levy has brought. So again, we want to make sure it is fair and balanced, but ideally we want the two sides to come together.
Okay, fine. You conclude.
Thank you, Stephen. Just finally on this whole subject, can I just quickly talk to you about the Ombudsman? What are obviously you will have heard our conversation earlier about the argument between whether it should be statutory or industry-led. Given we are where we are, what standards do you expect from the gambling industry in setting up this new Ombudsman and crucially for ensuring its independence?
Yes, so we've taken this approach because we want to try and get this established as quickly as possible. And I think our aim is that it will be established by next year, looking at social responsibility complaints and see the progress that it makes. But I'll be very clear, if this does not, if the sort of, the voluntary arrangement around the Ombudsman does not work, then we will have to look at that and look at a statutory model instead.
And as I think you probably heard from the Gambling Commission, there is the option as well of it becoming a licence condition on operators. So we feel comfortable that there are ways to hopefully ensure that there is strong compliance and strong engagement with it.
Thank you. Before I let you go, I'm sorry to do this, but I just can't let you escape, Minister, without, and I know this is not sort of entirely within the curtilage of your portfolio, but can I just very briefly ask you about the British Museum?
Yes.
Just want to know what the department's doing to ensure that the British Museum is now taking appropriate care of its collection.
Yes, well, obviously there are live investigations going on at the moment, so I have to be somewhat careful what I say, but I think I'd refer to the written ministerial statement where the Secretary of State outlined she'd been in touch with, or had spoken to the chair of the museum. We are very clear as a department that we need to ensure that investigation happens, but also lessons need to be learned, and we'll be monitoring that very closely.
And clearly this is, this has shone a light upon some really worrying facts about how record keeping and how collections are cared for. Is the government confident that other museums and galleries sponsored by the department are looking at this appropriately as well? Is this going to be one of those situations where it unearths a whole range of problems in other parts of the...
Yes, I know that my ministerial colleagues are certainly looking at this in terms of the wider picture, and as I say, once we've seen some of the conclusions of the investigation, but also even before that, following discussions that the Secretary of State had with the chair of the British Museum, we will be wanting to ensure that we are replicating that, if you like, with other organisations around the country.
Thank you for allowing me just to sort of prod you on that a little bit. It's just that, obviously, I've got, as my captive audience, it is the chair's prerogative. Thank you very much for your time today. It's been really very grateful to have you in front of us and for all your answers. If there's anything else you think of once you've departed, please do drop us a note on it. Order.
Thank you.
The proceeding has ended. 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 The proceeding has ended.